Hello, welcome to part two of my review of Suez by Keith Kyle in reference to the Suez Crisis of 1956. I'm just going to get right into it because we have lots to cover. I ended my part one of the book review and we'll just pick up right where I left off. Maybe I'm just going to show some of the photos again just to get people transported back to the time. Once again, we have the photo of Anthony Eden, Prime Minister of Great Britain, shaking the hand of Abdul Nasser in 1955. Some of the other most prominent figures the seated figures here. Ariel Sharon, who's looking straight ahead, and looking at him is Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion. The French, who are, of the four countries involved here, we have Britain, Egypt, France, and Israel primarily, as well as the United States and the UN. Where's the French? Aha. Prime Minister of France, Guy Mollet, seated behind the stack of papers. President Dwight Eisenhower. Secretary of State Dulles talking to the British representative to the UN, Sir Pearson Dixon. Now here's some propaganda. British cartoon that I believe they planned on dropping leaflets on the Egyptian cities. And we'll see whether that was an accurate portrayal of Nasser. November 1956. So let's see if the facts line up with that. Okay, so Nasser thought Britain would not attack because of reaction throughout the Arab world, the danger to its oil supply, that is Britain's oil supply, and that, quote, Britain would be unlikely to put the United Nations so blatantly at defiance. I believe that's a quote from Kyle. Nasser acting shrewdly, boldly, to the extent of being overextended by nationalizing the Suez Canal. It was a major coup. Eisenhower reacts very negatively to Israeli invasion and whispers of British and French involvement. Eisenhower comments to his security advisors, including Dulles, 29 October 1956, referring to Britain and France, quote, this is a quote from Eisenhower, nothing justifies their double-crossing us, unquote. That's from page 354 of Kyle. Oh boy, he's not happy. And this quote demonstrates that he considered Britain and France having done a backroom deal with Israel and attacking to be double-crossing him. And that's obviously a powerful person to tick off. Um, Eisenhower went on to comment further that he could not allow America to be called, quote, a nation without honor, unquote. So Eisenhower is ticked off. Um, so, so I'm just noting here in Eisenhower's reaction a striking conversion, even of Republicans, with World War II, with the process of World War II, a conversion from very eminent individuals in, uh, yeah, including Republicans, a conversion from Washingtonian doctrine of foreign policy and the Monroe Doctrine. Uh, you know, it was a major conversion or change of course for the foreign policy of the United States uh, during World War II. And it's striking to see this continuing now after World War II in 1956, that Eisenhower and Dulles, who are, well, Eisenhower is Republican, um, seem to be completely converted to the away from the Monroe Doctrine of, to put it unacademically, staying at home, which was Washington's famous admonishment at his departing remarks as president. For example, and to give another example of this new American attitude, Henry Cabot Lodge, the American permanent representative to the UN, his quote anti-colonialist views in Kyle's words, or is this the traditional American dislike of particularly English self-interest? Is this a traditional American attitude? Is this not so much maybe a conversion to this new multilateralism of the UN, so much as just a traditional American dislike of England looking good or doing anything, significant on its own? A very interesting question, and that's going to be in some of my conclusions here. What's the significance of this Suez Crisis, of the result of the Suez Crisis, with Britain and France sort of turning inwards or not being allowed to exert themselves in foreign policy like they did for the 1,000 years before this point, is a major change. So is that a conclusion we can draw? And was this the result of American pressure? Yeah, so Henry Cabot Lodge is another example of this new American attitude, or is it the old traditional American attitude? In any case, this characterization shows the old American revolutionary ethos or rejection of Britain lived alongside UN multilateralism. So I'm suggesting the two are living alongside each other here. Well, actually, Kyle asserts that these two American attitudes, the traditional and the new multilateral UN worldview, the globalism, live alongside each other in the person of Henry Cabot Lodge. Henry Cabot Lodge his father was somebody famous, and I'm going to ask Google about that. I should know that, but heck, a lot of history here. Oh boy, I'm going to get burned by Google here. Yeah. So Henry Cabot Lodge was born 1902 in Massachusetts. He was raised in one of New England's most distinguished and powerful Republican families. In addition, his grandfather and namesake Henry Cabot Lodge, 1850 to 1924, had been a U.S. Senator and one of President Theodore Roosevelt's closest friends and political allies. So, students of American history in this period, or in that period, will know who I'm talking about, but we've got a U.S. Senator and one of the closest friends of Theodore Roosevelt. And we also have Theodore Roosevelt's grandson, Kim Roosevelt, working for the CIA, advising Nasser in Cairo at this time, behind the British's back. Anyways, we've got some powerful American connections and families in place here. Interesting combo that merits further unpacking. Yes, this combination of traditional American suspicion of Britain and this multilateral thing. Why did they not support Britain in this? Very interesting, very interesting. So I would quote the financial consequences if the U.S. followed through on its what it decided to say it was going to do. The financial consequences, while it is not my area of expertise, must have been significant to Britain. Here at the outset of operations, Macmillan, Chancellor of the Exchequer, says to the British Cabinet, quote, "Our reserves of gold and dollars were still falling at a dangerously rapid rate, and in view of the extent to which we might have to rely on American economic assistance, we could not afford to alienate the U.S. government more than was absolutely necessary." On the eve of battle, this was not encouraging, especially for ministers like Lord Selkirk, who was Treasury spokesman in the Lords, who had never been able to see how Britain alone, or with France, could hope to carry the strain on sterling of such an enterprise, and had always been puzzled by Macmillan's insouciance. So the Americans are making rumblings about the financial credit to Britain. Now, what do they actually do? The British and French could not keep the Americans in the dark, but America could fly U-2 planes this whole time. So Eisenhower's reaction was very strong. Nothing justifies them double-crossing us. But this whole time, the Americans had U-2 planes, unbeknownst to the British and French and Israelis, or Egyptians, photographing everything that was going on in Egypt, Cyprus, Israel, everywhere. So so what does that mean? Is this are Eisenhower's remarks feigned? Are they? He's just ticked off that Britain's going to do something on their own, and France is going to do something on their own. Because he knows what they're doing. It's not that they've double crossed him. He knows what they're doing because of these U-2 planes. So it's just a. Well, I'll let the viewer decide. Eden definitely deceiving Eisenhower, although Eisenhower's deceiving him. On October 30, 1956, Eden writes to Eisenhower like he has no involvement with what Israel is doing. That's on page 359 of Kyle. From Americans' perspective, this causes reversion to traditional antipathy of the British. That's my 2 cents. The Labour Party reacts, with leader Hugh Gaitskell largely in the dark advising initially slowness and caution. If he had known all the details, he wouldn't have even held back initially, like apparently he did. Initially, Gateskill advising slowness and caution. That's page 360. Britain and France are saying to the US, we don't need you. The American ambassador in London, not even given the ultimatums issued to Egypt and Israel, gets them from some other guy. He transmits them to Dulles, quote 361. So, the British are definitely leaving them, purposely leaving the Americans snubbed. Winthrop Aldrich is a quote from Kyle, who had been promised a second interview with Selwyn Lloyd, British Foreign Secretary, after his talks with the French ministers. This is an American, Winthrop Aldrich, had instead been given Sir Yvon, some other guy, at 4:45, at a time when Eden was already on his feet. He was handed the two ultimatums. He immediately commented that Egypt could not possibly accept the conditions of the one addressed to her. Sir Yvon simply shrugged his shoulders. Dulles, after reading the text over the phone to the president, said that the 12-hour ultimatum to Egypt was, quote, about as crude and brutal as anything he had ever seen. Eisenhower called it, quote, pretty rough, unquote. To which Dulles responded that it was, quote, utterly unacceptable, unquote. The British and French would, of course, be in the canal by the next day. The president sent identical and coldly formal messages to Eden in Malay, making it manifest that he completely dissociated himself from their action and informed the press. So a rift, a chasm is opening up in British, French, and American relations. The American ambassador to, furthermore, Kyle demonstrates credulousness, taking at face value what Nasser says. For example, here he quotes Nasser in a 1966 BBC series and accepts Nasser's characterization that Eden was crazy to attack. Furthermore, Kyle extends this naivete to the whole Egyptian side, quote 371. This is a quote from the Egyptian Gazette. So Kyle's just quoting verbatim the Egyptian Gazette and not questioning their assertions here at all. At the beginning of chapter 20, he quotes, "The affairs of Britain seem now to be in the hands of a madman." That's the Egyptian Gazette, 31 October 1956. So this is the trite ploy of just saying your opponent's crazy. Is it likely that he was crazy? No, that's used way too frequently. Big Armada sails from Malta, 130 warships, including 3 British aircraft carriers and 2 French aircraft carriers. Kyle gives credence to negative characterizations of Eden's mental and physical state. Too many examples to list, so I won't list them. So there seems to be, because of these examples of just taking at face value that Eden was crazy, persistence of assumptions, narrative over evidence. That's not the best characterization of a work of history, but I'm not painting Kyle's entire work like this because that's not accurate, and I will give more of overall conclusions at the conclusions part. But Kyle also presents other opinions of this, and therefore, while he presents a picture predominantly negative of Eden's equanimity, and sanity, he presents details, other opinions, and deserves credit as such. So I give a assertion halfway through here. My assertion at this point, over halfway through this tome, that Kyle has an opinion on all this, but too good a journalist not to tell the other side of the story, to stick to primary sources, which he does assiduously and voluminously. He presents opinions and evidence that supports views other than his own. So I said there's two things going on with Kyle here. An example of Kyle's evidentiary objectivity, here quoting Eden's biographer William Rees-Mogg. Quote, "There have been many stories about Eden's exhaustion and irritability," he has written. Quote, "I saw no sign of it. He did show a rather boyish spirit, a sort of elated calm in crisis that seemed natural. It is not every day of the week you invade Egypt, even if your name is Anthony." Reference to Mark Antony, of course. Dulles, no fan of Nasser, exhibits a cold air of calculation. So this is Kyle. He also made it clear that it was not in assessing Nasser as a man to be, quote, dumped that he had differed in judgment from Eden. This is talking about Dulles. It was simply a question of the methods used and the pace and the occasion of the undermining of the Egyptian ruler. Wow. These are the guys pulling the strings. Or are they pulling the strings? Is Nasser the one in the driver's seat? Let's see here. Dulles then related these things to what had happened in Hungary. Okay, this is interesting. The West was now on the point of winning an immense and long-hoped-for victory over Soviet colonialism. Soviet colonialism? I've never heard that phrase before. In Eastern Europe, he said. Yet this was the very moment chosen by Britain and France to make the United States declare herself for or against Western colonialism. So Dulles is equating the Soviet Union, Britain and France, to the Soviet Union. Their colonialism preceded Soviet colonialism. It's just this confusing. He's just trying to smear Britain and France there. They had a treaty that owned the Suez Canal. They owned the Suez Canal. Egypt didn't own any of it. They sold their shares to Britain in 1875. So it's not equivalent to Soviet colonialism. But that's Dulles. He equates the two to the Soviet Union's activities in Hungary. I don't know the Soviet actions towards Hungary during that revolt, but I don't think it was very, tender. This American narrative propounded here by Dulles is absurd. America, the only country whose self-interest is not colonialism. Yeah. And wow, this is so consequential in the post-war world where everything is tarred and feathered with the word colonialism. And if the Americans engage in that, they're European. Aren't they undermining their own country? Their own undoubtedly great country? It's not in Dulles' mind here. He seems to think Britain and France are colonialists, but the United States is not. Well, what about manifest destiny and conquering the whole, half of the North American continent? That wasn't colonialism? Of course it was. But I wouldn't say that to Americans. It's call it manifest destiny. But it's another step to say that for them to critique Britain and France doing anything. They did all that themselves. So the Soviet Union and Britain and France, the same. I disagree. Russia is a large. This is why I disagree with this equating of all countries as bad if they do anything outside their own country. I'm going to qualify this. Russia is a large country with an incomparably large hinterland. Britain and France, on the other hand, are small, thus required to be trading nations with interests in other countries. This is one of the main problems with the Americans or the UN saying you can't do anything outside your own country. That's colonialism. You know, whatever name calling is going to be going on. England is a small country. It has to have trade in other parts of the world. Egypt was not even a colony. They had economic relations primarily. There wasn't a British control. Like the British didn't have a governor of Egypt, like they had a governor in one of the uh, Canadian colonies, Nova Scotia or Canada. It wasn't a British colony. It was an economic relationship and political relationship, but they didn't govern the place. They didn't have an English uh, ruler of Egypt. That was the viceroy, and that was the Ottoman Empire up until World War One. So it wasn't a British colony. It had some relationship between Egypt and Britain. Um, so I'm saying that because of the smallness of European nations, and this also applies to Spain, Holland, even Germany. Germany obviously screwed up massively in World War II, but they're being smaller compared to the United States or Russia. They have a legitimate point that they can trade and have relationships and investments in other parts of the world. And if people are going to call that colonialism and call them racist for that, well, how is any small country supposed to do anything? You just stay at home like this is the Middle Ages? That's unrealistic and unmodern. And the United States should let Britain and France pursue their interests in other parts of the world. And the miserable UN too. So obviously the same applies for Arab countries, Asian countries, anything else. I mean, it's the phrase escaped from colonialism, telling of the American perspective. Of course, it stems from the revolution and therefore understandable, but if one digs beneath the assumption that American self-interest is not colonialism, but that of other European countries is colonialism, that manifest destiny was not, but British and French self-interest is, that is untenable. Quote from Kyle, Eden's mounting anti-Americanism. Of course, the British had their own experience of the American Revolution that could be fired up again. Eden's mounting anti-Americanism was showing as he launched his statement to the House of Commons on 31 October. A quote, the response to this by the leader of the opposition. Gateskill delivered a root and branch attack on the government's policy, which was described by many who heard it as the most brilliant speech from the opposition benches for many a year. He accused the government of abandoning at one blow the three principles governing British foreign policy since World War II. Solidarity with the Commonwealth. Okay. The Anglo-American alliance. and the adherence to the UN Charter. And he cited in some detail the doubting sounds from such normally loyal associates as Australia and New Zealand, which were strongly suggestive of a lack of consultation. But the UN was at the center of his case. The government had complained throughout the crisis. How far do I go on here with Gateskill? So I gotta cut that short. So Gateskill is singing the tune of the UN, the new multilateral worldview where Britain cannot do anything on its own like it used to. So this is the opinion of the Labour leader Gateskill. Again, well, I'll let Kyle off the hook there. Foreign Secretary Selwyn Lloyd bizarrely felt he could lie outright to the House. In his October 31 words to it, quote, "There was no prior agreement between us," meaning Britain and Israel, "about it," the invasion, unquote. Well, I should say that all through. Quote, "There was no prior agreement between us about it," unquote. That is a blatant lie. And why did he say that in the House of Commons? Well, whatever, he's lying through his teeth. But my point is this is war. This infamous deed of having had a meeting with the French and Israelis in Paris. Yeah, what are they going to hold a public meeting saying what they're going to do and like invite Nasser to the meeting? So I don't see what the big dastardly deed is, but there's no doubt that Lloyd lied about it in the House of Commons. So I'm saying Labour and Kyle had a point that Lloyd lied about this, but don't have a point that the lie is a big deal, that there is anything wrong with allying with Israel. Well, he's talking about the lie was about communication or agreement, prior agreement between Britain and Israel. Although Gateskill was primarily angry that there was a departure from the new shiny UN globalism. Kyle, while maintaining fairness in relating the variety of British opinion, consistently writes as if the Egyptians can do no wrong, an inveterate liberal trait, small l liberal. Furthermore, the astonishing fact about this book, conspicuous in its absence, the Egyptian chronological initiative in having seized the canal. It's like Britain and France can't do anything, but it was completely okay that Nasser just seized the canal, and he didn't do it with a bunch of grannies, from a knitting club. It was obviously the point of a gun. That's all completely okay. Egypt can take initiative in foreign policy, but Britain and France can't. This is the argument of all and sundry, except Eden and Malay, and a few of their stalwarts. Furthermore, the astonishing fact about this book, I already said that, the habit of people of encapsulating their opinion in an assumption. This is absolutely ubiquitous in the so-called media today. And they act like the reader and the citizens don't know that they're doing it. They continually talk an assumption that's completely, their opinion. They talk like it's fact. It's a habit that's just absurd. It's like, given that the Canadian people do not have the legal right to do this, we think they should be arrested. It's like, who said that the Canadian people don't have any right to do that? It's just continually talking an assumption, like we're stupid. Eisenhower responds. Eisenhower is hot under the collar. Quote, the United States, he declared, was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. We believe these actions to have been taken in error, for we do not accept the use of force as a wise or proper instrument for the settlement of international disputes. Oh my goodness, you gotta be kidding me. This is the United States talking? Um, wasn't Eisenhower the chief allied general in World War II? What's he talking about? The Americans expected the British and French to run into immense trouble with their supplies of oil. They would need to get access to substitute supplies from the Western Hemisphere, for which they would be short of dollars. Quote, they may be planning to present us with a fait accompli, then expecting us to foot the bill, Eisenhower told Dr. Arthur Fleming, the director of war mobilization, on 30 October. Well, that may be he may have a point there. The British and French are going off gallivanting, but they expect the Americans to advance them a big loan if they get into financial trouble. Now, that's a legitimate point that Eisenhower's got there. Kyle would be open to the criticism he's a labor hack if not for his meticulous and lengthy relation of the perspective of Eden and others, and by this later fact he redeems this subjectivity. So I'm making a statement on Kyle's writing in this work. The House of Commons explodes, figuratively speaking. Yes. Thursday, 1 November, astonishing scenes in the House of Commons. Quote, the question put to the right honourable gentleman simply amounts to this. This is Gateskill, I think. Wait. No, this is Anurin Bevan, who hitherto had played a strangely muted role in this affair, so that some Tories affected to see a contrast between his sense of responsibility and Gateskill's lack of it, now came forward. Quote, the question put to the right honourable gentleman simply amounts to this. Under the orders of the government, British airmen, soldiers, and sailors have been sent into action. If they are captured and no declaration of war has been made, what protection have they under international law? Unquote. The House rocked with shouts of answer. Eden responded unconvincingly. Quote, the action which has been taken has been, as I explained yesterday, in accordance with the statement we made, unquote. Pretty, that's a diplomatic response. Basically said absolutely nothing. There was no holding the House. Bevan rephrased his question at greater length. The Speaker said it could all be dealt with in the debate, and, led by Bevan, the opposition side of the House contradicted him and shouted him down. Speaker Morrison suspended the sitting on account of, quote, grave disorder for half an hour. Wow, he said to suspend the House of Commons for half an hour. An experienced witness in the press gallery described what had happened as, quote, quite the most shattering experience I've ever sat through. The divisions, the uproar, the emotions were much worse than at the time of Munich. Wow. It was, he said, like a Reinhardt production. Who's Reinhardt? These old references. Oh, this is too big of a quote. But let's see what happens in the House of Commons. As often happens when the House resumes after a big row, the debate on a motion of censure was somewhat of an anticlimax. It was not moved by Gateskill, and the Prime Minister was calm but uninformative, except to say that there had been no declaration of war, but that troops in, quote, armed conflict were covered by the Geneva Convention. The earlier release of anger seemed to have exhausted and perhaps shamed the House. Sir Anthony Eden, with his calm manner and unprovocative language, imposed himself on the debate, to the relief of the Conservative backbenchers. He had bought a little time, yet in seeking to lower the atmosphere and blunt the shafts of his criticism by his unsensational style, Eden supplied the means by which his whole policy would be unravelled. Quote, we do not seek, he said, to impose by force a solution of the Israel-Egypt dispute or the Suez Canal dispute or any of the disputes in the area. The first and urgent task is to separate these combatants If the UN were then willing to take over the physical task of maintaining peace in that area, no one would be better pleased than we. So he's sticking to his contrived plan of supposing that Israel and Egypt were fighting and that France and Britain were only there to separate the combatants. It is definitely a contrived way to go to war. The winding up speech for the opposition was made by Bevan, who compared the wording used in the ultimatum to Egypt with that used in the German ultimatum to Belgium in 1914 and the German ultimatum to Norway in 1940. Well, this is the narrative they are attempting to take. And then, Gateskill says, quote, there is something the matter with him, Eden. So this is the idea they're trying to put in everybody's mind, that Eden's off his rocker. Before Rab Butler could reply to the debate, an unusual event occurred. From the Tory backbenches, up jumped the young member for the Wrekin, William Yates, who was subsequently to be an MP in Australia and Administrator of Christmas Island. He had intervened once before in the debate, when a speaker had remarked that Israeli troops had not yet reached the canal, saying, quote, the plan was that Israel would not reach the canal in any case. Now he appealed dramatically to the speaker. I am a young member of the House, and I desire to have your advice. I have been to France, and I have come to the conclusion that Her Majesty's government have been involved in an international conspiracy. Okay, so he's going to spill the beans. At this point, the speaker called him to order. Gateskill intervened to say that Yates evidently, quote, evidently has an extremely important communication to make to the House. But Yates merely managed to blurt out naively that he wanted advice as to whether, in these circumstances, it would be considered right and patriotic for a person deliberately to try to bring the government down. It was the nearest brush the House was to have with the truth in these days of earnest and ferocious debate. At the end of the debate, the motion of censure was lost, 324 to 255. The Liberals, for the first time, capital L Liberals, I didn't know the capital L Liberals were still in the House of Commons at this time, but in a small party, for the first time on this issue, voted with the opposition. So there's a big row in the House of Commons, and one Conservative MP spills the beans on the, or makes a reference to, the secret meeting with Israel and France that is the dastardly deed here, according to Kyle. So Eden's own Attorney General throws cold water on the legal justification. So Eden's getting undermined by his own ministers here. The Attorney General is definitely a major figure, especially, the legal, is this war legal? Eden's own Attorney General throws cold water on the legal justification. Again, the Constantinople Convention, this is me now. Again, the Constantinople Convention conspicuous in not being mentioned, and bases this the Attorney General bases this legal opinion on the replacement of vital interest, which was the 19th century, politically, socially acceptable reason to be involved in other parts of the world. He replaces this with the modern European yardstick of the UN Charter. So Eden's got some Judases here. That's a strong word, but he's going to war here. This is serious business, and his own Attorney General is singing a tune of the UN Charter. Ouch. Yeah, and this is an early example of the new kind of conservative who's basically just a internationalist, globalist person and doesn't really have any conservative behavior. Eden's own commander-in-chief, that's General Cately, throughout the war, cut from the same cloth as his Attorney General, quote, page 392. Oh, this is trouble. So, quote from Kately on 11 December 1957, the one overriding lesson of the Suez operation is that world opinion is now an absolute principle of war and must be treated as such. World opinion. Globalism. The Canadian and Australian Prime Ministers. See what Canada was up to here, and Australia. Yeah. Canadian Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent was in an uncharacteristic rage, though he composed himself to write a courteous reply to Eden's cable of 30 October, rather than the, quote, brutal and unfriendly, unquote, message that was rumored at the time. Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent was in an uncharacteristic rage, though he composed himself to write a courteous reply to Eden's cable of 30 October, rather than the brutal and unfriendly message that was rumored at the time. Okay, so he wrote a courteous reply of barely suppressed rage to Eden. Underlying that, Eden's cable had arrived behind the press reports of the ultimatum, and observing that he found its reasoning unpersuasive, he deplored the effect on the UN. So Saint Laurent's, singing the new UN tune. But would Diefenbaker have sung that tune? I think not. Of which Britain had been, quote, such a staunch and steady supporter, the splitting of the Commonwealth and the fracturing of the Anglo-American alliance. It's the end of the world, basically. Saint Laurent managed to hold in his real feelings, largely by refusing, often brutally, to give any press interviews at all until the later part of November, when in a debate in the Canadian House of Commons, he rejoiced that, quote, the era when the supermen of Europe could govern the whole world has and is coming pretty close to an end, unquote. So they're all turning on Britain and France. Menzies, Prime Minister of Australia, usually a stalwart, says this is Kyle, in a major speech, Menzies found it, quote, entirely reasonable that action had to be taken with no delay for Commonwealth consultation. So Menzies is, once again, not going to stab the British in the back. Above all, the canal must be protected. So Australian Prime Minister makes a stand, and he's a rare leader to do this. Lester Pearson, the Canadian Minister for Foreign Affairs, told Norman Robertson, the High Commissioner in London, that's the Canadian ambassador in London, to express, quote, our feeling of bewilderment and dismay at the decision which they have taken, while the Security Council was meeting in New York, decisions which came as a complete surprise to us and which had not been hinted at in any previous discussions, unquote. So Pearson is not, and Pearson was a long experienced diplomat, so he was not happy. And particularly being kept in the dark too, he was not happy. But the British, as in World War II, Churchill, Mackenzie King was a supporter of the war effort, but not, wholeheartedly. And Churchill didn't really, he had no illusions about Mackenzie King. He preferred Menzies. But the Conservatives, obviously, Churchill being the leader of the Conservative Party, which is something I'll just note, that this whole narrative about Anglo-conservatives being Nazis, it's like, no, Winston Churchill was the leader of the Conservative Party who defeated the Nazis. He wasn't a Nazi. Just to clarify that, one of the probably top 3 facts of the 20th century. Who was on what side in World War II. Doesn't stop people from calling Canadian and American conservatives Nazis, the guys who died defeating the Nazis. Louis Saint Laurent was a lawyer, whereas Menzies was not. So this would definitely irk a lawyer. So the Indian Prime Minister, Pandit Nehru, quote, quote, "In all my experience of foreign affairs, I have come across no grosser act of naked aggression than what Britain and France are trying to do against Egypt," unquote. Who, he asked, had assigned the role of policeman to Britain and France? The 19th century was over now, he emphatically declares. That's my addition at the end there. Lester Pearson, Canadian Foreign Minister, suggests a UN police force to supervise the canal. So Pearson becomes prominent here at the UN, not supporting Britain by any stretch. Another major geopolitical thing going on, this is contrasted to the first shots fired in World War II when Canada was just, there was no doubt that it was, going to fight on the British side in due time. I think Mackenzie King dragged his feet a little bit just to make the point that we made our own decisions, which is fine, but there was no doubt on what side they were going to fight. Whereas here, that's no longer the case. Things have changed. It's the new internationalist globalism. And Canada seems to be on the side of the former, at least the Liberals, capital L Liberals. So another major geopolitical thing going on at the time is the Pan-Arab Alliance against Israel coordinated by Nasser. That's an understatement. I'm just going to repeat that. Another major geopolitical thing going on at this time was the Pan-Arab Alliance against Israel coordinated by Nasser. Do I have to say that that's ringing a bell here? But this time it was headed by Nasser, one individual. In 2023, is there one individual? Things are developing. Is Erdogan the new Nasser? Well, let's see here. Kyle relates much info on this Pan-Arabism coordinated by Nasser. For example, the communication on splitting Israel in two. This is serious business. This is from the primary sources. Kyle is going to relate information on this. The communication on splitting Israel in two by an invasion to the Mediterranean by Syria and Jordan had obviously previously been in the works, because Egyptian War Minister Major General Hakim Amr made the phone call to Syria and Jordan to mobilize infantry and tanks to do this. There is obviously an entire coordinated plan on the Egyptian side for if hostilities broke up, and the goal was to at least split Israel. And so does that have to do with the canal? No. So is this, Kyle says that Nasser can do no wrong, but he seems to skip over this. Although he does, to be fair, he relates the information on it. So maybe I shouldn't judge Kyle on that. Even the Egyptians even had a code word for the operation to split Israel called, quote, Operation Basan. That's from page 399 in Kyle. So that does affect the whole, oh, poor woebegone Egypt, It already has a fully prepared plan to split Israel in two by Syria and Jordan attacking. It doesn't have anything to do with the canal. But Nasser at this point hesitated. He was aware he would be plunging the entire Arab world into war. Also, and again, the echo here is deafening. Erdogan? Also, he had not making an enemy of Eisenhower on his mind. Erdogan does not appear to have that on his mind. In particular, as involving Syria would stop oil pipeline shipments from Iraq that crossed Syria onto the ships at the Lebanese coast. Oh my goodness, this is such a gigantically interconnected situation. So I asked a question here. Is a major factor here whether Egypt, and here also Libya, adhere to a signed treaty when push comes to shove, or side with fellow Arabs? This is a major phenomenon. Besides Nasser's seizing of the canal, here Libya, so this is another example, not just Egypt doing this. Just the Constantinople Convention, what's that? No. Another example, this here is Libya. So Libya throws its treaty with Britain out the door as soon as its hostilities commence. Quote page 401. In return for subsidies from Britain, she gave British forces, that's Libya, gave British forces bases and training rights. When plans were made for Musketeer, that's the British code word for the invasion of the canal, it has been seen that the immediate assumption was made that 10 armored divisions stationed in Libya would move in the tracks of Rommel up to and across the Egyptian border, and that Libya's harbors and airfields would be at Britain's disposal. Any such illusions were very rapidly dispelled. That front was no sooner spoken of than it had been closed down. On 30 October, the Libyan government denounced Israeli aggression and reiterated that it would refuse permission to forces stationed in Libya to attack any Arab government and to prevent this by all possible means. So, the money it had taken from Britain and this in exchange for allowing it to station forces in Libya, as soon as the Israeli attacked, that was all. Just forget about that. Besides Nasser's seizing of the canal, here Libya throws its treaty with Britain out the door as soon as hostilities commence. Again, Western countries can act in self-interest. Again, non-Western countries can act in self-interest, but not Britain and France. Dulles condemns Britain, France, and Israel in UN General Assembly and a vote taken. The Americans just are very unhappy. The American resolution, in effect but not in name, condemning the three powers alike, was carried by 64 votes to 5. Only Australia and New Zealand joining the three in the dock, with 6 abstentions, including Canada. So the Americans are even more strongly rejecting the action taken than Canada, who abstains, and Australia and New Zealand vote with Britain. And British representative at UN messages Eden. You should know, cabled Dixon from the chamber of the Assembly, that even our closest friends here are becoming intensely worried at the possible consequences which might follow if we and the French remain for long in open defiance of the UN. They point out that the Assembly, in its present emotional mood, will not easily be held back from moving to more extreme courses if we pay no attention. Besides sanctions, quote, our friends were also said to be concerned that open defiance would result in there being no option for Britain but to leave the UN altogether. The effect of this on the Commonwealth and on the whole of the network of Western alliances might then be disastrous. It was with this judgment in mind from a diplomat of whom he had the highest opinion that Eden was that day to face the House of Commons. So the Americans are leading the UN against Britain. This is serious. The Americans alone disagreeing is serious, let alone the Americans leading the UN against Britain and France. In explaining his vote of abstention, Pearson makes his capital L liberal opinion heard. That's my 2 cents. So, Pearson's opinion. In particular, he regretted 2 omissions: a procedure for the permanent political settlement of the question of Palestine and of the Suez Canal, and the setting up of a UN force large enough to keep the borders at peace while the political settlements were being worked out. The later was an old idea of Pearson's which he had raised with Eden a year before, but it was now an idea whose time had come. It was seized on by Dulles. In another short intervention, he endorsed it with enthusiasm and invited Pearson to formulate and introduce a concrete proposal. So Pearson's coming forward, I have to say, completely undermining the whole British and French invasion, and he's got another plan that's in line with the new way of doing things. But he's just completely thrown Britain and France under the bus. And he's siding with the Americans? I'm shocked. Although Sir John A. Macdonald would not have been shocked to read this book on the 1892 election. This wonderful book by Christopher Pennington on the 1891 election. There's Sir John A. He did accuse the Liberals of treason with the Americans. So, Sir John A. would, you know what he would have done here. The Economist piles on Eden. Everybody's piling on here. The Economist wrote of Eden's splenetic isolation and declared that for an opposition officially to oppose a war after hostilities have started is, in modern times, unprecedented. Really? I find that hard to believe, but so too is what Sir Anthony Eden has done. It's unprecedented in modern times. Are you kidding me? This is like in World War II, this entire Suez invasion would have been like a dull day. Not minimizing the loss of life, but compared to World War II, what they've just been through 10, 15 years before, this is hyperbole. The manner in which the crisis has been handled suggests a strange union of cynicism and hysteria in Britain's leaders. The Economist is painting the dark picture. Nor did the gentleman from the Times, an organ which Sir Anthony flattered himself he knew how to handle, justify the extraordinary confidence he had reposed in them. Rather, its leaders reflected the first reactions of Sir William Haley, these guys from olden days. Their position was founded on the relationship with the United States, a reminder amid so many fashionable expressions of anti-Americanism that pro-Americanism was still a powerful tide. On 2 November, Haley used a Churchillian quotation with devastating effect. This is objective journalism by The Economist. I hold it perfectly justifiable to deceive the enemy, even if at the same time your own people are for a while misled. This is getting confusing. How's he applying this here? There's one thing, however, which you must never do, and that is mislead your ally. Ooh, that is a damning quote from Churchill. But Eden had his own mind with respect to relations with the Americans. He didn't agree with Churchill's. He wasn't as pro-American as Churchill. Can the actual constituent countries of the British Empire be determined by the UN vote? Yes. Only Australia and New Zealand voted with Britain, and only Canada and South Africa among the measly 6 countries who voted to abstain. That's the truth. All other supposed members of the Commonwealth voted to condemn Britain, India, Pakistan, etc. France a different kettle of fish than Britain. The obvious statement. No, quote, special relationship with the US or the Commonwealth. Freer to pursue its own interest and already at war in Algeria. So France could say, screw you to everybody because it didn't have as many relationships, political alliances as close as the British had with the US and the Commonwealth, for what the Commonwealth was worth. The Commonwealth was all of those countries. The Empire was Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa, in my opinion. And I've read dozens of books on the subject. France, a different kettle of fish, yes. Logistically, France allowed their Mediterranean forces to be placed under the command of General Cately, probably a big faux pas, to use a French phrase, but several times acted on its own initiative, and effectively so. Eden persisted in his attempt to call Britain and France, quote, peacemakers. Bullied by neoliberalism. General Cately, that's my comment at the end there. General Cately later wrote this pivotal statement. This is the guy, this is the general in the field, so he does have power, influence in this situation if he wants to undermine things. It was the action of the US, this is Cately, it was the action of the US which really defeated us in attaining our object. Oh, maybe this is interesting. The movements of the Sixth Fleet, quote, endangered the whole of our relations with that country. This situation with the US must at all costs be prevented from rising again. Okay, so this is excellent primary source information from Kyle. This is the general, on the, I don't know if he was on one of the aircraft carriers or if he was the commander in the field. And he's saying that the American Sixth Fleet was shadowing them and causing trouble. This is unbelievable. This is dangerous. They're gonna fire on each other? This is 1776 here. Eisenhower's getting riled up. I mean, that's just serious business. Eden persisted, full quote called for. Yeah, this is Really golden information. Uh, this is in the thick of the fight. According to Admiral Arleigh Burke, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Navy, the Sixth Fleet's orders were to keep in close touch with the British. Oh my goodness, this is not keeping close touch as allies, this is shadowing them. The Sixth Fleet's orders were to keep in close touch with the British and French, quote, to make sure we knew where they were and what they were doing, unquote. Oh my goodness, this is unbelievable. He had sent orders to Admiral Cat Brown to, quote, go to see if his bombs up. Oh my goodness. This is unbelievable primary source information. So this is Admiral Arleigh Burke, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Navy. So this is the top brass. He said he had sent orders to Admiral Cat Brown to, quote, go to sea with his bombs up, ready to fight anything. Cat Brown sent back, quote, who is the enemy? Unquote. Ultimately, I had sent back, quote, don't take any guff from anybody, unquote. No, the Americans are a formidable opponent in any fight, but this is unbelievable. They went. This is dang close to war between the United States and Britain and France. Oh, this is unbelievable. Dulles, once the ultimatums had been sent, asked Burke whether there was a way the Sixth Fleet could be used to stop the operation. Quote, and I said, Mr. Secretary, there is only one way to stop them. We can stop them, but we will blast hell out of them, he said. Quote, well, can't you stop them in some other way, unquote? I said, quote, no, if we're going to threaten, then you've got to be ready to shoot. We can defeat them, the British and the French and the Egyptians and the Israelis, the whole goddamn works of them. We can knock off if you want, but that's the only way to do it, unquote. This is unbelievable. This is unbelievable. On November 3, there were reports that the Sixth Fleet had moved off to the northwest, but on the night of the 4th, 5th, searchlights were shone on the blacked out vessels. Oh my goodness, they're shadowing the British ships with their lights off. Next morning, dummy runs were made by American planes on French ships. Oh my goodness, this is unbelievable. 2 American submarines, nobody knows the details. Bravo on Kyle, this is incredible information. 2 American submarines had to be sharply ordered to the surface. On the morning of 5 November, when Anthony Head asked Sir William Dixon what position the Americans could have been expected to take up if it were the intention to interpose the Sixth Fleet between the Allied convoy and Egypt, the answer was that its present position was ideal for this purpose. The Americans are quite serious. Mountbatten, told this by Dixon, backed it up. Admiral Brown had been asked if he could move, but had replied that he had taken up his position on direct orders from his government. The long shadow of the Sixth Fleet, the ever-present symbol of American disapproval, fell ominously across the path of Musketeer. The Americans are killing this operation. It's the Americans that are standing in their way. And that's primary source information there that's showing that. That is unbelievable. Their ships are moving between the British and French ships in Egypt. It's like they're almost fighting on the side of Egypt. I don't like to characterize the Americans' action that way, but when they're physically coming between the British and French ships and Egypt, that's pretty unbelievable. But they didn't fire apparently yet. See what happens. Yeah, that quote was unbelievable. Bravo on Kyle for that. That is unbelievable. I am not sure if this is purposeful, but Kyle departs from his meticulous chronological relation of facts when describing or failing to describe the British and French air assault. Yeah, so Kyle creeps through the chronological events here. And then when the actual British landings and French landings occur, he kind of just he skips over that. In other words, he doesn't want Britain or France to look good. He doesn't. That's what's he does that here. So he remains impartial on Israeli and Egyptian ground fighting throughout Sinai, but then hardly mentions in passing. Yeah. So he briefly skips over the entire actual British and French landings. The Anglo-French airstrike had completed its work under Phase 1 of Musketeer by 2 November. 260 Egyptian planes had been destroyed on the ground. What? For the loss by anti-aircraft fire accident of 7 aircraft and 3 pilots. But he doesn't want to talk about this stuff. That's the British destroying the Egyptian Air Force. 260 Egyptian planes had been destroyed on the ground? Wouldn't that mean that the Egypt was out of the war right there? If the British and French have air superiority, they could have just bombed the snot out of Egypt. And yet Kyle just skips over that like, oh well. Some damning actions and statements by Nasser to the conclusion. So this, we've got the picture of Nasser here. Maybe that was accurate for a few days, but what happens? Some damning actions and statements by Nasser to the conclusion he was no moderate leader rather sounds like an Arab Mussolini, and I give Kyle's evidence from his actions and speeches at this point. So I'm going to back this characterization of Nasser up. Is he the poor, helpless creature that the American Sixth Fleet has to defend here? And then the American people are conspicuous in their absence. Kyle, or you don't hear from Dulles. The American people? I seriously doubt the American people could have cared less about that entire part of the world. Anyways, they're not even mentioned in this entire book. The American people, or barely the British people, are even mentioned. This is quite an elitist view of the world. It's these powerful figures pulling the strings, and the people, oh, who cares about them? They just serve in the front lines for whatever we decide. So I'm going to back up this characterization of Nasser from information from the voluminous Kyle. On 2 November, just after the Allied planes had been over Egypt, Nasser drove in an open car to perform Friday prayers at the Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo, a place of enormous residence in the Islamic world. Oh my goodness, this is so loaded. Oh my goodness, the echoes of this are just like, So he's playing the Muslim card here. I have to say, this is what the primary evidence is saying. Oh my goodness, this is so huge. He was everywhere applauded by crowds who lined the road. After the Friday, this is unbelievable. After the Friday sermon, he addressed a crowd in the open air and explained why the troops had been withdrawn from Sinai, leaving, he said, suicidal squads behind. That's it. That's primary source information. Further information. He had agreed that it was better to take poison than to surrender. The United States, he told Alfand, who was some ambassador or somebody, in the presence of other State Department officials, quote, the United States wants the success of your enterprise. Okay, I gotta read this whole thing. Rumors reached the French of the strains at the top in Cairo. Nasser was said to be on the verge of resignation and only remained in power on the urgent representations of the American ambassador. Okay, this is there's a story is coming into focus here. That Pinault was saying this openly was reported to Washington and vigorously denied by the Deputy Undersecretary Robert Murphy. Quote, the United States, he told Alphen in the presence of other State Department officials, quote, wants the success of your enterprise provided that it can succeed with the shortest delay. That is not true based on what the U.S. Navy was being commanded to do. Undersecretary, Deputy Secretary of State, I believe, Robert Murphy, the United States wants the success of your enterprise. That's not backed up by the facts. Is the French information accurate that Nasser was on the verge of resignation and only remained in power on the urgent representations of the American ambassador? And I'll wait for the conclusions, but to what extent is this? And once again, the American people are never consulted, but you've got these high-placed American officials directing, representing this new international liberal world order, whatever you want to call it, multilateralism, UN. And yet there's a debate with that within the United States, but these guys, this is a Republican administration. They're propping up Nasser. That's just especially after the Iraq War, American people have no desire for their secret service and government to be just so deeply integrated in these Middle Eastern countries. But here it's shocking to see them integrated in the Egyptian government against Britain and France. And that's what the primary evidence is indicating here, despite the denial of this Deputy Undersecretary. These spicy pieces of information don't stop Kyle from waxing rhapsodic on Nasser, comparing the style of Nasser's mosque speech to Churchill. Ouch. Nasser, a dictator, this is my comment on that comparison. Nasser, a dictator in power from a military coup, Churchill was elected. Small difference there. Nasser and top officials planned Nasser going underground to mount a guerrilla campaign. That's page 419. And Kyle, I quote that if anybody wants to look that up. Big piece of information. An apparent split, although this is just one piece of info, in U.S. State Department. Dulles furious. Undersecretary Murphy. Yeah. So there's split in the State Department. Dulles is for being involved in Egypt and undermining Britain and France. And this Robert Murphy is perhaps genuinely of the opinion that he wants the enterprise to succeed. Okay, so he's not lying. There might be a split in the State Department here. And in American opinion overall. Oh boy. Kyle compares British to the Nazis at Nuremberg. Okay. Kyle's slapping of the term, quote, Nuremberg on the actions of the British. He's got not an entire chapter title, but a section title called Nuremberg here. Kyle's slapping of the term Nuremberg on the actions of the British political and military leaders at Suez is ridiculous, and telling about his restrained but vitriolic opinion on Suez. Yeah, he lets the cat out of the bag there a little bit too much. Now, the figure on the number of people killed, the Egyptians killed in this operation, and there's also information I'll provide on this, but approximately 750 Egyptians. Hitler death toll 20 million, Eden death toll 750. And Kyle saying Nuremberg, Nuremberg, Nuremberg. French politicians, that is Pinot, the foreign secretary, reacted to international opprobrium by doubling down and urging the British to speed troop landings. The French are gung-ho. Very interesting. The French are very ticked off by this. Probably because, like I said, the deep-rooted significance of de Lesseps and the canal in French identity and accomplishment. All this during final weeks of U.S. presidential election. Oh boy, you gotta remember this. Eisenhower's Democratic opponent, Adlai Stevenson, and John F. Kennedy hammer administration for unreliability and alienation of America's chief European allies. This is very interesting. Now, to what extent were they just doing this as an election ploy? We've got the Democrats being anti-globalism, internationalism, or are they just criticizing Eisenhower for undermining Britain and France as an electioneering ploy? But they're doing it. Eisenhower's private thoughts. This is going to be very interesting. Okay, quote, "Life gets more difficult by the minute," President Eisenhower wrote on 2 November. I like everything I read from Eisenhower. It just seems like a really cut and dry, no spin kind of an individual, which I really like. "Life gets more difficult by the minute," President Eisenhower wrote on 2 November to his old Army friend General Al Grunther, who had just retired as Supreme Commander Europe. Quote, "I really could use a good bridge game," unquote. He had been talking with some of his old British friends in the last few days, and they were truly bitter about the action of their government. Throwing Eden under the bus, one man said, "This is nothing except Eden trying to be bigger than he is." That's really cutting. I do not dismiss that. Once again, that brutal British political discourse. I do not dismiss that lightly. I believe that Eden and his associates have become convinced that this is the last straw, and Britain simply. This is Eisenhower speaking or writing. So one man said, quote, "This is nothing except Eden trying to be bigger than he is," unquote. I do not dismiss that lightly. I believe that Eden and his associates have become convinced that this is the last straw, and Britain simply had to react in the manner of the Victorian period. If one has to have a fight, then that is that, but I don't see the point in getting into a fight to which there can be no satisfactory end, and in which the whole world believes you are playing the part of the bully, and you do not even have the firm backing of your entire people. Here Eisenhower's private thoughts stood for those of most Americans. Really? No, maybe he's true. Maybe that's accurate. Except for the sneaking feeling among many that it would be splendid if, despite everything, the bullies were to carry it off. So the American, he's thinking, well, maybe the American people don't mind an adventure, or seeing someone else go on an adventure. The president discussed the possibilities with Dulles and Hoover at the White House 2 November. After his wearing night at the UN, Dulles thought Lester Pearson might well suggest the Eisenhower-Nehru approach. So they are consolidating around the Pearson. UN goes into the canal and sorts everything out. But now, wow, Dulles suffering from cancer, stricken with pain the night of 23 November, or 2 and 3 November, and operated on. Well, that's a significant fact. So was Dulles at his best here? No, he wasn't. By no fault of his own. Canadian leaders, again, the Canadian people never mentioned or consulted, while their leaders acting like UN cheerleaders. Canadian UN military something or other in Cairo to keep the peace or something, prophesies, quote, a terrific loss of life, and, quote, it is in our opinion that this will be an act of barbarous brutality. Nuremberg, Nuremberg, Nuremberg. Communication circulated by the UN. Czar Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General of the UN. Yes, John A. Macdonald would not have agreed. Kyle correctly pinpoints here what two paths the Suez Crisis highlighted. I'm going to summarize this as the old unilateral path and the new world order globalism path. That's the significance of Suez. A parting of the ways, and the world went one way. And were the Americans smart to allow that to happen? For whatever reason, would it have been more in American self-interest, meaning that they don't have to go around the world putting everything in order, if they, for which they always, themselves and their own people end up like in Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan, in the end, just not thinking was a good idea. So was it a mistake for the US to not let Britain and France exert themselves in this part of the world instead of the Americans having to do everything or attempting to do everything themselves? But this is the path that the world took at this point with the support of the US. And was that a big, ginormous mistake? The background to this too, I have to say, from World War II is that is Roosevelt. Roosevelt was strongly for this new multilateralism and the UN, and that the old way of doing things, that World War II, World War I and World War II had proven that the old European system of vital interest, each country doing what is in its own interest, had failed because of the horrors of World War I and World War II, and this would never happen again, and we have to go to a global UN, of course, directed and pretty much synonymous with US interests. So here we have Eden saying, no, Britain wants to do something for itself here again. And France is saying, no, France wants to do something for itself again. And the US is saying, and the UN is saying, no, 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 no. So, the two paths at the point of Suez, and the world took one. The one real American leverage over Britain, although it had others too, namely force, but another real leverage the US had over Britain was economic sanctions, coordinated by the UN. This is serious. Coordinated by the US or the UN. Much overthinking in the eye of the storm. I'm talking about the British politicians. Not all of them, but once again, unhistorian-like bald subjective opinion related in the form of a loaded assumption. Kyle can't help himself. For some reason, this Suez thing just ticks a lot of people off. The Secretary General had made it quite clear that, in his opinion, the inclusion of any British and French units would be quite unacceptable to the Assembly. This was a major blow to Eden's capacity for self-deception. That is an assumption that Eden is deceiving himself. I don't think Eden would have agreed with that. So a historian should not be writing like that. At the heart of his crisis this crisis is the Egyptian seizing the canal once again. Never talked about in Kyle. It's assumed that Britain and France are the bad guys and that Egypt's the good guy, and the fact that Nasser seized the canal in the first place is completely forgotten, never mentioned. Furthermore, that the UN and US back Egypt says a lot. Arguably that the lauded unilateralism of the UN and US practically one and the same. The lauded multilateralism of the UN and US practically one and the same. Major fact here that British representative at the UN, Pearson Dixon, told the Foreign Secretary Selwyn Lloyd on 4 November that, quote, a sanctions resolution will be carried against Britain and France, unquote. He made it clear that in all probability this would include withholding oil supplies. If the US or UN could have enforced economic sanctions on Britain, including on oil imports, obviously there would have been chaos. But while Kyle again takes Dixon's statement at face value, was this practically possible? Would the Americans have starved the British people? Literally? No. Eden chickened out. Does the UN's charter include starving people? Question mark. Apparently yes, because they did that in Iraq to like 1 million Iraqis during the Clinton administration. So the lauded multilateralism in its career is by no means, pure as the wind-driven snow. So is the moral nadir to occupy the Suez Canal and, sadly, kill 750 people. But it's the height of post-war morality to starve millions of people through withholding of needed supplies. And not just in this case. How many times has the UN or the US economic sanctions deprived people of basic necessities that are necessary to feed their families? So war, which is useless unless you're a monster, unless you are a monster and ignore the Geneva Convention, kills soldiers, is morally evil. But internationalism, that by withholding of necessities by economic sanctions kills multiples more, is good. I think American public opinion in 2023 is very far advanced on this point. Absolutely sick of this whole New World Order, liberal, globalism stuff. And things have changed. I don't even think they would have agreed with it in 1956, but their leaders didn't seem to think about them. Because the Americans always get burned when they try to do anything. They just get blamed. And if they did, like in Iraq, they did starve those. The economic sanctions put on Iraq by Clinton were killed many millions or hundreds of thousands of people. And then of course they invaded under W and killed another 1 million more. American people, while there's no doubt on their opinion on the Iraq war today, or at the time, I was at grad school in the United States during the Iraq war, and I certainly wasn't in favor of it, but I have to think, well, no, I met lots of Americans who had actually gone over there and fought, and they had horror stories. But practical military points raised. Okay, what do we have here? So the Egypt Committee of the British Cabinet were inclined to change tack and accept Pearson's plan for an international force to intervene. And I don't want to skip over, like Kyle does, that the British and French planes bombed the Egyptian Air Force and targets in Egyptian cities, and that British and French troops landed, and paratroopers landed behind the Egyptian lines. The Egyptians fought back. The government gave firearms to civilians. I'll come across the page reference several times. Kyle provides evidence for that. So this is all going on here, but Kyle doesn't want to talk about that. The Egypt Committee said of the opinion to change tack, provided British and French forces were part of the UN force, and Australia and New Zealand backed the plan provided this as well. But practical military points were raised, and Eden decided to put the decision to continue with the military operation to the full cabinet, which then convened the same day, 4 November. Undoubtedly, this was a storm, the biggest storm since World War II and perhaps since 1956. This is a fork in the road. So with individual ministers, except one, agreeing to the final decision would be whatever the majority of the cabinet decided. The result of the cabinet meeting on, I believe, 4 November was the decision that the, quote, initial phase of the occupation of the canal should go ahead. So the British cabinet stood firm on November 4th with the entire wrath of the United States government and the entire world, except for Australia and New Zealand, breathing down upon them. They stood firm. Paratroopers dropped morning of November 5th. Nasser government distributes small firearms to civilians at Port Said at outlet of the canal. That's page 475 of Kyle. This is a major point that I have to make, that Nasser is no fool. He understands the Western liberal sympathies for people being abused, which is completely legitimate, but he's playing on that. He is not stupid. He purposely gives firearms to civilians so that public opinion around in the West will turn against Britain and France. But does the liberal press in the West know they've been duped? No. Kyle bites that hook, line, and sinker. But Nasser, okay. So his chiefs of staff in control of the military operation were convinced the British and French would land west of Alexandria and not at the canal, but Nasser personally was convinced the canal would be the point of attack. On his own initiative, Nasser left Cairo and went to Port Said and was almost captured by French paratroopers. Israelis use napalm, page 446. This is not on civilians. This is in Sinai and military. There's no big cities in Sinai, but still, that's a pretty damning fact. Israelis use napalm. Page 446. Kyle waxes rhapsodic on the moral stand of the labor leaders in the House, who praise the UN and hammer the government to calls from the conservative backbenches of Pravda, Pravda, Pravda. The Pravda chant accurate in reference to the entire media ever since. It's my addendum. Air attack on military targets, or at least those intended targets, going on in Cairo and other cities. On the ground, the Egyptian commander told by Nasser to reverse course and fight. So he was thinking of surrendering, maybe? Nasser says, no, stand firm. Soviet arms given to civilians and fighting resumed at Port Said. Commander-in-Chief Kately giving half-throttle messages to commanders on the ground. For example, quote, no guns of greater caliber than 4.5 inches will be fired, unquote. Is that war? That's Soviets primarily preoccupied during these days with uprising in Hungary, but proffered moral advice to Britain and France. I just throw one thing out here is that one difference between the Suez Crisis and this current crisis in the Middle East is that Russia, this is so macro, but is it a difference? I was going to say there's a difference between this crisis, the 1956 Suez Crisis and the current crisis is that in 1956, the Soviet Union was preoccupied in Hungary. Because if it had not been preoccupied in Hungary, this could possibly have been World War III in 1956. And this is ridiculously serious. If people don't think that is the case, let's recall Eden mentioning to Nasser when they met for the one time that nuclear weapons against Russia in the Middle East was at least in Eden's mind. And maybe he said that to impress Nasser, but this is serious business. But at this point, the Soviet Union was preoccupied with Hungary, so they were giving Egypt weapons, but it didn't escalate to the Soviets becoming directly involved. It's just so serious I can't even talk about this in reference to today. But of course, today there is the Ukraine war going on. So to a certain extent, Russia is preoccupied, but this is so serious. It's just, oh my goodness. Khrushchev scolds Malay for reneging on his socialism. This is very interesting. Quote, during our meeting in Moscow last May, you said that socialist ideals inspired you in all your work. But what has socialism in common with the predatory armed attack on Egypt, which is an open colonial war? It's interesting to see the Soviet anti-colonialist discourse. They know the communists knew that this narrative would undermine the West, whereas now it's in the mainstream Western media. This is taught to all of our kids in Canada. But this is Soviet propaganda at the time. Wow, if they were alive today, they would, or they're just Hitler and Stalin and Mao at their poker game in hell are just like applauding. All anti-colonialist narrative has trounced the West. Here we have Khrushchev decrying an open colonial war, and that's now the mainstream narrative of the entire Canadian media and pseudo-educational system. On the ground, the Egyptian commander told by Nasser and Cairo to reverse course and fight. Soviet arms given to civilians. Fighting resumes. Khrushchev scolds Malay for reneging on his socialism. Embarrassing for French and British. Like the socialists. So the communist makes this distinction between the crushing of Eastern Europe uprising, good, and colonialism, bad. It's entering into, well, it's all propaganda. There's no point in entering into the Soviet mind like it was logical. It's all propaganda to undermine the United States and the West. And it's just, Eisenhower responds to Soviet overtures to join with the US to bring peace. Eisenhower agrees with the Soviets to bring peace to Suez and the Middle East. This is unbelievable. Ike's tone was harshly hostile. Bulganin, that's the Soviet Prime Minister's letter, was an obvious attempt to divert world attention from the Hungarian tragedy. Okay, so Eisenhower's still, as you would expect, up in arms against the he just riled by the Soviets. Eisenhower dismissed the idea of the two of them joining forces to stop fighting. Okay, so I reversed what I just said there. Eisenhower balked, as you would expect he would at that. I beg forgiveness from our American friends, the neighbors to the south. Eisenhower, yeah. Eisenhower promptly ordered the U-2s, oh my goodness, this is such high-level stuff, into action over Syria and Israel, but not over the Soviet Union. If these flights disclosed Soviet air forces on Syrian bases, Eisenhower thought there would be reason for the British and French to destroy them. So Eisenhower is not going so far as to support the Soviet Union, and he's okay with the British and French possibly destroying these Soviet airplanes in Syria. Oh my goodness, this is so serious. This the echoes today. This is terrifying. Oh, I just hope nothing happens. Britain had nuclear weapons, but France did not, and thus the Soviet saber rattling scared France and caused a major change in their attitude to continuing the Suez operation. This is a pivotal fact. With the hawkishness, compared to the hawkishness they had demonstrated thus far. Well, that would disturb anybody. So the Soviet saber rattling, nuclear saber rattling. This is unbelievable. France summoned U.S. ambassador and communicated to him they were prepared for a ceasefire. So the French are pivoting here. And the U.S., if the U.S. sponsored it, so as to make plain France was doing this to shield itself from Soviet missiles. Oh my goodness, it's so serious. Ground landing of troops, 6 November, push through Port Said, link up with French paratroopers. British kill 12 civilians. That's on page 463 of Kyle, and I do not, jump over that. Back in London, Macmillan gets cold feet. Kyle relates that while there is no evidence, his treasury officials informed him. Yes, Macmillan. Macmillan the villain. Is he? Back in London, Macmillan gets cold feet. Kyle relates that while there is no evidence, his treasury officials informed him of this in such stark terms. Great information by Kyle. Macmillan scared the cabinet on November 6 with dire figures on the devaluation of sterling. That's Kyle, page 464. Previously, an American government or IMF loan would have been expected to span a temporary drop in sterling's value, but that was a political impossibility. Kyle attributes to Macmillan, quote, a loss of nerve at this point. A quote, a sensational loss of nerve. So Kyle is providing pivotal information here. This is what's pivoting the British actions here. Is Macmillan's scaremongering. And why did he do that? German Chancellor Adenauer moves in for the kill. That's unwelcome. No offense, but the Germans shouldn't have been moving in for any kill anytime soon there. Of course, that's a figurative characterization I make there, but let's see, what does he do? Page 467. Well, I don't apply that to Germany now. I think the Germans paid their dues. That's a ridiculously serious statement. I don't want to be, glib about that. German Chancellor Adenauer moves in for the kill on England and France. Quote 467. When the conversation with Eden ended, the old Chancellor Adenauer said, quote, France and England will never be powers comparable to the United States and the Soviet Union, nor Germany either. Pretty self-defeating statement. There remains to them only one way of playing a decisive role in the world, that is to unite to make Europe, so we've got the EU ethos being proclaimed by the German Chancellor. England is not ripe for it, but the affair of Suez will help to prepare her spirits for it. That actually turned out to be true, but not because of the path that ended up going down. England is not ripe for it. Oh, this is disturbing to any English or British person hearing the German Chancellor say what England's going to do. England is not ripe for it, but the affair of Suez will help prepare her spirits for it. Ugh. Churchill would have just erupted at this. We have no time to waste. Europe will be your revenge. Huh? I don't know. Whatever. I'm not sure the people of England would have agreed. Yeah. The climax was that Eden's cabinet ministers bailed. So we're getting to a climax here. Climax of the Suez Crisis. Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Templer, who saw much of Eden during the climactic days, Eden's wife and the 4 chiefs of staff physically by his side at number 10, but not one cabinet minister. Is that really significant? He's got his wife and the 4 chiefs of staff but not his cabinet ministers. What are his cabinet ministers sleeping in the guest bed? I don't. Maybe British people would know if that's significant or not. Anyways, this is related by Chief of the Imperial General Staff Templer. Eden telephoned Molay and ascribing much to the effect on the British currency, the scaremongering by Macmillan had obviously had an effect, said he could not hold out any longer. The pivotal question is, would the Americans have actually starved the British people? No. So it was scaremongering by Macmillan or the Americans or both. But they turned the aircraft carrier figuratively and literally around. Eden telephoned Molay and ascribing much to the effect on the British currency, said he could not hold out any longer. Molay wanted to keep going. Despite the Soviet nuclear saber rattling? Oh my goodness, this is unbelievable. But it has to be credit given where credit is due here. The French actually stuck to their guns here. Eden appears to have wanted to change course before Molay. Eden not despondent, as Selwyn Lloyd thought, quote, he had perhaps done enough, in Kyle's words. Eden not despondent, rather sort of Selwyn Lloyd said he had perhaps done enough. Where's Churchill? Where's Churchill? Churchill would have said, fire away. Eden not despondent, His bitterness, that is, Eden's bitterness, was later more against the Americans. Page 468. The Empire. The speed with which India turned on Britain soon as the going got tough, when actual invasion of Canal Zone commenced, dispels any illusions about the true nature of the Commonwealth. In the case of Middle Eastern allies, Turkey and Iraq in this Suez Crisis instance, Iran and Pakistan, their release of joint statement on November 6 laying intense stress on loyalty to the UN. So they throw Britain under the bus. Forget about the delusion that Pakistan and India and are part of the British Empire, the Commonwealth. They never got on the ship. They didn't jump ship. They never got on the ship. It's not to say that they ever should have got on the ship, but it's delusional to call them part of the Commonwealth. The real empire determined by that UN vote. Here Kyle deludes himself and the reader that somehow this process, the release of this statement coinciding with a decrease in tension, the new Commonwealth remained intact. Wishful thinking. That quote's from page 488. This quote completely delusional, opposite the facts he's relating of the action of India and Pakistan. So yeah, in reality, the facts are, and he relates the facts, India and Pakistan threw Britain under the bus, but somehow Kyle spins this as the new Commonwealth remained intact. It's like, what are you talking about? And I'll relate that the Canadian federal election was, depressingly close upon the heels of the Suez Crisis, where Diefenbaker won. And this just not even thought of by Kyle. Of course, I don't think Canada's even on his radar here. Besides people don't know the political dynamics in Canada. They don't even care. Most of the time, rightfully so. But in an instance like this, if Canada had a government that supported Britain, it would have been a huge deal, actually. I don't know, Eisenhower might have... I won't even think about that. Yikes. Thus, Kyle has a preference for the new Commonwealth that in fact sides against Britain in practical situations. Yeah, what's the point of that new Commonwealth? As such, Kyle shows who he really is. Gladstonian liberal. More than a Gladstonian liberal, a New World Order liberal globalist. Eden's government wins vote of non-confidence. 8 November. So the backbenchers standing firm, and I think the British public opinion standing firm. It's only the elites that's getting weak-kneed. Kyle, faithful to the historian's creed, relates example of the majority reaction of grassroots conservatives constituency associations. There, that's backing up what I said with evidence here. But then just as much shows his disdain for their plebeian views. That's my opinion. Neoliberal globalist elitism. Kyle again here shows his personal, not historian's hand. Kyle ascribes to The Economist an oracular quality that it still ascribes to itself. Kyle drops a reference to his pleasure at the ousting of Margaret Thatcher in, let's see, when was Margaret Thatcher ousted? Slightly before my time. Apologies to my our British friends. Okay, so Margaret Thatcher resigned in 1990, almost later than I thought. So Kyle's referring to with glee. In any case, as a historian, he shouldn't really be dropping such subjective information. Kyle drops a reference to his pleasure at the ousting of Margaret Thatcher here due to the process of the annual Conservative Leadership Review. So, anyways, yeah, injecting his personal political views and agenda. So what he's saying, he wished Eden would have been booted like Thatcher. While Eisenhower, I don't even know if Thatcher was booted. I'm just sorry, I'm not up on that period. While Eisenhower, in the glow of his re-election victory, so Eisenhower wins the election in November. Is it? Yeah, no, November. Initially in a good mood, in a mood to be lenient to Britain and France. Dulles had his way, and U.S. and UN stance completely uncompromising against everything Britain and France had done. Oh, this is very interesting information. There's differences of opinion within the American administration, including the president wanting to maybe be more lenient as soon as he wins the election. But Dulles is the New World's multilateralism hammer here. This is important information. Amazing how world turns on nuances of American culture I have here. Really amazing. These just slight differences of opinion within high-placed individuals in the American government. The whole friggin' post-war period is turning on this. It's just unbelievable. Kyle faithfully relates the opinions of Lloyd and the UN representative Dixon, a good summary of Eden's supporters' views. So what are the people? Is there anybody that wanting Eden to stick to his guns here? Literally. According to the American account, Selwyn Lloyd said it was monstrous to let small nations get away with aggression, while accusing great powers of aggression against them when they acted in self-defense. I totally agree with that statement. I'm reading that again. According to the American account, Selwyn Lloyd said it was monstrous to let small nations get away with aggression while accusing great powers of aggression against them when they acted in self-defense. This is sensible. But it just, and Nasser here completely understands the Western liberal mentality of, I don't want to look. In some instances, it's actually really important. I'm not saying this liberal trait is illegitimate in certain instances, but anybody who is suffering is immediately a victim that needs to be defended. They know that. They know that you feel that way, and they're playing you like a big frickin' bass. Just set the hook. And you're a sucker if you think that that's genuine. There's some information here that I was from a podcast I was watching recently that something really interesting to research would be the relationship and discussions between Yasser Arafat and the KGB in building up the entire Palestinian narrative along these lines. Nasser knew how to play this Western sentiment like a cheap fiddle. And I think this whole Palestinian thing, is it by accident that the Gazans have never been resettled in Egypt or the other Arab countries? Are they? Do the Egyptians not know that there's 2-3 million people there? No, they know, and they are playing the Western liberals like a used fiddle. And good for them. If you're going to be a sucker, it's not the guy's fault who's ripping you off. According to the American account, Lloyd said it was monstrous to let small nations get away with aggression while accusing great powers of aggression against them when they acted in self-defense. Sensible. Dixon is recorded because the small countries. Dixon is recorded as adding in an aside that Britain could not be held to so-called charter principles that she did not believe in. Yeah, so Selwyn Lloyd's holding the line here. If the United States had, quote, led the hunt against us in the UN, unquote, the Foreign Secretary maintained, the British and French, quote, would have had a brilliant. If the United States had not led the hunt against us in the UN, the Foreign Secretary maintained, the British and French, quote, would have had a brilliant success and Nasser by now would have gone, unquote. Britain had known that an Egyptian attack on Israel was planned to take place in 5 or 6 months' time. What? This is incredible primary source of what? Britain had known that an Egyptian attack on Israel was planned to take place in 5 or 6 months' time. Is there a footnote here? Where did he get that just like zinger of a piece of information? What? There was a planned invasion of Israel? Well, there was as soon as Israel invaded. Egypt was on the phone to Syria and Jordan about splitting Israel in two. But here, Selwyn Lloyd states that Britain had known that an Egyptian attack on Israel was planned to take place in 5 or 6 months' time. Lodge, that's the UN American ambassador, intervened here to remark that it was a pity Britain had not shared that knowledge with Washington. Oh my goodness, this is such high-level information. This is unbelievable. And that Soviet penetration, which had already gone farther than Americans believed, would then have reached its high points. This is what the Americans is the line in the sand. They're ready to throw Britain and France under the bus, but as soon as the Soviets are starting to look good, then they're like, oh, screw that, you know. So you may think we act okay. So this is Selwyn Lloyd again. You may think we acted rashly, immorally, and behind your backs, but the UK had to do what it did. There was no alternative, unquote. Dixon added that this was the historic moment to act, and historians like Toynbee would say so in the future. Well, I'm here in 2023, and I agree with that. I agree with that. I don't agree with the globalist one world order. Way too broad, way too prone to be. It's too macro. It doesn't allow for individual national cultures and the diversity of nations, which I find interesting. I don't this whole one world government stuff. The Canadian federal government's too big. How big would what would fall through the cracks in a one world government? You know, if a couple billion here, a couple billion there. People, not dollars. This is disastrous. Who would ever think such an idea would even know about the cares and details of individual people's lives in every country in the world, not just Western countries? Obviously, these macro elites in New York and Washington, did they really care about the individual Palestinian? They're playing a gigantic macro game. Every country should be allowed to look out for its own best interest, and maybe they'll have a responsible government develop representative institutions to do that. I don't want a one world emperor. It would be way disastrously general. The ambassador would have been well aware of the then current American craze for the British historian Toynbee's theories, the cyclical rise and fall of civilizations. I'm going to have to look into that. It's very interesting. The British force in Port Said, Lloyd contended, was the only strong card the West had to play against Nasser. If any force was going to replace it, would have to be a great deal stronger than the 3,000 Finns, Scandinavians, and Colombians being assembled now. No offense to the Scandinavians, but is Nasser really going to respect that? If it had been, 10 centuries before and the Vikings, I think he would have thought twice, but is Hammarskjöld, is he really going to bring the hammer down on Nasser? I don't think so. It would have to be at least as strong as the 15,000 British and the 3,000 or 4,000 French who are there now. Okay, there's some numbers on the troops on the ground in Egypt, like at Port Said, 15,000 British, 3,000 or 4,000 French. How come there's way more British than French? I mean, I thought the French were up to their necks in this. As for the threat of Russian intervention, he reproached the U.S. with allowing herself to be bluffed by Moscow. Wow, this is such high-level stuff. If there were to be 50,000 volunteers, Britain would know how to take care of them. Oof, tough talk from the British Foreign Secretary. He's saying, let the Soviets bring 50,000. All this made a lamentable impression upon Lodge, who felt that Lloyd's attitude was, quote, reckless and full of contradictions. I like this. I like this talk from Selwyn Lloyd, standing up for his own country. All this made a lamentable impression upon Lodge, the globalist, who felt that Lloyd's attitude was reckless and full of contradictions. It made him far more pessimistic about the British than anything that had happened so far. Quote, he is in a dangerous state of mind, once again, crazy, dangerous state of mind, which could touch off a war, and which, I understand, reflects Eden's view. Lloyd had had his way, but got nowhere. The Americans are a wall against what the British and French are doing. Although there's Eisenhower's seems to have had changes of opinion at various points. Not Dulles, though. There is no doubt about the way the American government acted, but this passage argues for a lot going on under the surface, yeah. This indeed an astounding, deeply revealing entry into the American relationship with Britain, the complex and ambivalent American relationship with Britain. Very much the case. Back then, now, people's connection to their country's history is becoming so far removed almost that I don't know if you can say that anymore, but that's sad, and I hope that's not the case. I think that the American-British dynamic should be one of rivalry, that's healthy. But that would have to be connected to, Canada and other countries, because increasingly the Americans just aren't going to care about Britain unless it reasserts its vital interest. It's almost too complex to put into words. The British deceive themselves by thinking the Americans are categorically on the side. The Americans, to be true to their hearts, can never do that, but do not begrudge Britain when it stands up for itself, though they cannot bring themselves to say it publicly. This is the Canadian perspective. Nevertheless, okay, yeah, so I'm not minimizing the casualties, I'm not, but the Hitler versus Eden in the Championship of Evil score: Hitler 20 million, Eden 750. Nevertheless, Swedish journalist snaps photos of Wehrmacht-like devastation. Macmillan playing some kind of personal game. Here he remarks to U.S. ambassador that he ought never to have been moved from the Foreign Office. Yes, this is Macmillan angling for what? Angling for what? Dulles in hospital battling cancer. Okay, this is an important primary source fact here. And thus, Secretary of the Treasury George Humphrey, who was really anti-British, played a central role in his absence. His obstruction of Britain with the IMF, a major factor in British government's reversal of course. See page 465, 485, 501. So he actually did cut off IMF loans to Britain. This is a huge, huge deal. If he didn't resume them, would they have started to... Well, they can't import food, they can't import oil. He did cut off the loans. So is that giving credence to... Oh. Would the Americans have actually continued to do that while the British people start to... I just don't think so. Anti-Americanism among the British people, quote 507. Well, if this got out, what these loans are financing being withheld. Petrol rationing had just been announced, and cases were reported of petrol stations refusing to fill up American cars. The First Lord, Lord Hailsham, with his American mother and rambunctious style of oratory, found words for the feeling of many Suez supporters when he spoke at Oxford. "We will not be sermonized," he said. "We do not propose to be sent to Coventry." I don't know what that means. "We do not wish to hear any more lectures from those whose moral weakness and incapacity to see the facts was the precipitating factor in the present crisis." So this is the Americans really responsible for allowing Nasser to even seize the canal. Because if they would have been, if Nasser would have known, the Americans would have hammered him. Along with the British and French, there's no way he could have done that. These bloody French, who says this? The British Foreign Secretary was not in the least amenable to any such suggestion. Oh boy, what's going on? These bloody French, he blustered to Lodge. First they put planes all over Israel, and now they flatten out completely. He would rather go down fighting than have a UN general decide such questions. Lloyd supposed that in England they would go right off the roof at the very idea, and he felt like doing the same. So Lloyd is standing firm. The Israelis or the French are wavering. There's actually, this is in a crucible here. This could have been World War III, so this really was a crucible, the biggest deal since World War II, and perhaps since until 2023, perhaps. Oh my goodness, it's so stressful. And different individuals are responding differently in the crucible. So Macmillan is described here as, quote, the leader of the bolters, unquote, and, quote, he has been busy posturing as the scourge of Nasser. Posturing. That his real intentions were, quote, to push his boss out of number 10. Of course, Macmillan became Prime Minister. He did succeed Eden very shortly here, and went on to basically end the empire. Pinot now does a 180, tells chief UN commander he now prepared to let him call the shots on withdrawal. Selwyn Lloyd stands firm. It is tragic, cabled the ambassador 26 November, to sit here in London and observe the rapidly changing attitude. This is the American ambassador cabling back to the US. It is tragic, cabled the ambassador 26 November, to sit here in London and observe the rapid changing attitude of the British public towards us. I believe it is not exaggerating in the slightest degree to say that we are rapidly reaching the point where we are thought of by the British public as enemies of Britain, working against them with the Russians and the Arabs. Oh my goodness, this is unbelievable. Here, British Cabinet Minister Robin Turton says the American eagle be smeared with oil. Cheap oil for themselves, or possibly also the price of oil, the American government's objective in the Middle East? British ambassador to U.S. Secretary. Yeah. But once again, I'm just going to return to that pivotal fact about the U.S. Treasury Secretary, who's obviously an extremely powerful figure. But this guy brought down the British Empire? This guy? Who is this guy? Humphreys? If the British would have just... I'm not saying it's easy. And who shoulda, coulda, woulda. But this Humphrey guy, he's going to starve the British people? I don't think he would have done that. Eden missing in action, ill, or in any case, away from London. Away from London. I think he goes to Jamaica. Hard to find a minister, or at least the top ones, willing to go down firing. Lloyd then offers to resign. Lloyd offers to resign at the end of November. Rab Butler, leader of the Commons, and in top two with Macmillan regarding successor to Eden, here doesn't even see any advantage in holding a beachhead in Egypt, a literal beachhead, as a bargaining chip. Just withdraw. So they're all jumping ship, except for Selwyn Lloyd seems to be holding on a little bit. Of course, the British people are all in favor, or not all in favor, but mostly in favor, and reacting very negatively against the Americans. At least that's the primary evidence is showing. Sir Francis Drake and Churchill conspicuous in their absence. I'm just noting the astonishing difference in the British compared to their World War II behavior. Or not all the British, but some, like their leaders. How did they hold fast in the, looking at the fire-breathing dragon of the Nazis on a scale of fighting probably 100 or 1,000 times, and then they can't continue or swallow the Suez Crisis, like the minimal fighting going on at the front of the Suez Canal. It's bizarre, although maybe what is going on is the traumatized memories of World War II you're not wanting to repeat. So that is a legitimate sentiment. But is that going to keep them from their country exerting its interests in the world? I think that the British people would have certainly liked the latter, and will like it today. UN Secretary Hammarskjöld, the new Pope, placed the moral authority on the British and French ambassadors while making clear he prefers dealing with the dictator Nasser to the complicated democratic elements tediously represented in the British parliamentary system. International elitism. Why does he prefer dealing with the dictator Nasser? Because it makes him look good by supporting the poor woebegone underdog who is playing him like a used fiddle. Yes, in Britain we have cabinet, not presidential government, so we actually have discussions in the British cabinet that are and individuals taking different opinions that are very pivotal here. Tory backbenchers and a large percentage of the British people furious over talk of turning tail. This is confirmation from Kyle here. Eden government in danger of falling to vote of confidence, including from its own backbenchers. Richard Nixon comes on the scene, enters the scene as new vice president, chairs meeting of U.S. National Security Council, and along with Dulles at this point steps back from torpedoing Britain in light of Eden possibly being replaced by a Labour government. The Americans, why didn't they think of that before? Eden checks in from Jamaica. Selwyn Lloyd reads a statement, December 3, of the government's decision to withdraw forces. Eden MIA. U.S. Secretary Humphrey immediately opens the spigots of the IMF loan and oil from the Gulf of Mexico. Ka-ching, ka-ching. The general effect of this, the attempted replacement of Britain and France in the Middle East by the U.S. Disastrous. American people ever want that? No. How's that been for the world since? There's been so many wars that the U.S. been involved in the Middle East, I can't even remember them all. Why did the U.S. want to replace Britain and France in the Middle East? Their people were never consulted. The essential objective of Britain, and likely France, in the Middle East was oil and its delivery. U.S. replaces Britain. The Suez invasion, as cut short in its final effect for Britain, was to make its bargaining position worse than before the invasion, and much worse than before Nasser's seizing of the canal. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. But not the British people, you'd have to say. Finally getting to the pivotal factors throughout this entire slice of history. 1. The action of U.S. Secretary Humphrey in blocking financing to Britain. Very pivotal fact. Could Britain and France have held out? Could Britain and France have held out despite this action? That's that's a major question here. That's point number 2. Could Britain and France have held out for even a few weeks, and then the Americans would have had to make a decision? Are we really going to starve the British people and French people? I don't think that would have happened. But in the crucible, easy to say from safe distance. I have to say, where's Churchill here? Where is Churchill? He probably said, I've done everything, I've said everything, and if they consult me, they have to make their own decisions. They're grown men. But there's no doubt about what Churchill would have thought. Full speed ahead. Third major point here. What would have happened then? Fuel shortages in Britain, the British government defaulting on loans, and the devaluation of the currency temporarily. The jumping ship of disingenuous members of the Commonwealth. That actually did happen. And it was acted like it didn't. It would have meant all-out war between Britain, France, and Egypt. There's no doubt about that. Which would certainly have resulted in Britain, France, and Israel winning the war and in possession of the canal. Yeah, I mean, unless it's going to spark a war across the Middle East. Oh my goodness, this is so serious. Well, Iraq said to Eden at the outset of this, hit Nasser and hit him hard. So we have to remember there's differences between the different Arab countries. It's very important, at least in this instance. In this Suez Crisis, Egypt and Iraq were vying for leadership of the Arab world. Who's vying for leadership of the Arab world today? Saudi Arabia, Turkey. They don't necessarily have the same interests. Iran, who's not Arab, but they don't necessarily have the same interests. Is it necessarily going to be a pan-Muslim? Oh, this is so serious, I can't even think about it. Yes, the modern balance of power interaction between nation states. Characteristic of the modern period to World War I and the Wilsonian League of Nations globalization of liberals in the West. So two paths, and the world followed the latter at the point of the Suez Crisis and ever since. In actuality, did Wilsonian Rooseveltian support for a global body supplanting traditional balance of power relations between states weaken its main allies and thus its own position? Like, it's in the US's best interest to have a second tier powers like the British Empire, like the French Empire. It's in the US's interest to not have to do everything itself. Yes, that's in the US's interest. Taking the resultant decline of Britain and France as major powers after Suez as fact, what has been the results of this? Number one, the rise of the power of the Arab countries financially and demographically. Two, the loss of Western influence over the key Suez Canal. Three, the lack of Western, particularly European, bargaining power with the Arab world, its resultant recent move to the fold of the CCP. This seems to be US policy in respect here, seems to be very consequential. Once again, the legitimacy of Britain and France, or Spain, or Holland, interest not in occupying other countries, but having trade relations with other countries. And strong interest there is that they are small, densely populated countries. They aren't like the US, where they have markets, resources within them. They have to trade elsewhere because they are small, highly densely populated countries. So to smack their hands and call them racist if they are pursuing interests in other parts of the world is not accurate. Not all countries are the same. And they shouldn't be treated on this moral level. Well, you're a good guy, you're a bad guy, and you gotta stay at home, bad guy. This is so simplistic, it's just ridiculous. This moral, whatever happened to the separation of church and state? I believe liberals are in favor of the separation of church and state. So why this moral structure being imposed upon politics and relations between states? It should be about trade, self-interest. Yeah. Not all countries the same. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand and South Africa should support Britain in this fact that it's a European country with a small land base and large population there, so why shouldn't Canada trade with Britain? So I am finally at the point of conclusions. I'm done, Kyle. Page, dizzying page number. Kyle is right under 600 pages. But I think I've related so many conclusions, and this is such a macro thing. I'm really going to skip ahead for the sake of the reader, or the viewer. Conclusions on Suez by Keith Kyle. What is the horrible deed that hangs over this entire thing? It's specific to British culture, but it's that Eden was asserting nationalism again. This was the big no-no of the new globalism. The new Yes, this assumptions hang over the narrative. This assumption that the British Empire is over. Britain's end of empire? Question mark? Kyle certainly wants it to be. Nobody asks Canadians, and Kyle doesn't even think of it. Yes, the views of Suez on the part of the British people barely aired by Kyle. So I'm going to end this review and these two reviews by looking specifically at what Kyle says about the Gaza Strip. So to leave that major subject to the end, I'm just going to skip over the other conclusions first, or the conclusions, and then I'll get to what Kyle says about the Gaza Strip at this pivotal time. So one major conclusion is that Israelis live in their daily lives day to day with Arabs. I've been to Israel. When I was younger, I spent 2 or 3 months actually building a school in the Palestinian part of Israel, in Bethlehem, with a bunch of other teenagers, and a wonderful organization that sent teenagers around the world, mostly Americans and Canadian teenagers, to do development projects. One of the most wonderful experiences of my life. We were in the Palestinian part of Israel building a classroom at a Palestinian girls' school. I saw a lot of stuff there. Israelis and Palestinians live with each other in Jerusalem and other. We were mainly in Bethlehem and Jerusalem, but the British and French during the colonial period also, like in Cairo, had experience living with Arab people. Americans never have. This is an observation that I make. What can we conclude from this? The Israelis are aware of Muslim, not necessarily Arab, secular culture. Like a lot of the military and political leaders are secular. They're not Muslims. But Israelis are aware of Muslim conceptions of war. The Americans, there's obviously innumerable intelligent, educated people in the United States, but this thing of living in Cairo, living in India was more the experience of the British. And these so what is the Muslim view of war? Is it the view of Kyle? Is it the view of liberals in the West? I mean, it's ridiculous. No, they have their own views. And what are those views? There's the quote from the Hadith Bukhari 52 verse 269. War is deceit. Nasser appears to be operating on a completely other conception of war than the liberals at the UN, and yet they don't seem to know that. And we do have evidence of Nasser both harshly disposing of members of the Muslim Brotherhood. Earlier on, there was, in the first video, I referenced that information from Kyle, but also playing the Muslim card when it suited his purposes, particularly in a sort of a pan-Arab, pan-Muslim war mode. So that's why the Muslim views of war are applicable to Nasser and to other Muslim people in the Middle East. But they have their own culture, their own views. They do not subscribe to the views of the economist. But the economist doesn't seem to realize that. The French experience inclines them to act closer to the Israeli response. Muslims and Arabs only respect strength. That appears to be another part of Arab culture, not necessarily Muslim culture. The British halfway between pro-Israel and pro-Arab. The US should just not even attempt to engage in the Muslim and Arab worlds. Not out of any disrespect of Americans, but just the American people have no appetite for it or no interest over there. Britain and France, as smaller countries with large populations, need to trade. They need to be involved in other parts of the world. The United States does not necessarily have to do that. That's the great blessing of the United States and Canada, is to have such gigantic resources and land bases that we don't have to go gallivanting around the world. Or even we have a system of internal trade within our own gigantic countries. That's the great blessings of Canada and the United States. We don't need to get our oil from the Middle East. We can get it from ourselves. We don't have to send our soldiers over there. But Britain and France, they have to be involved somewhere else. Maybe they, after recent events, will maybe hit up Canada and Australia a little more, less the Middle East. The US should not just even attempt to engage in the Muslim and Arab worlds. I'm sure the American people would, I'm not telling the Americans, giving them advice. Their own people think that. Eisenhower, big mistake not to do this, in my opinion. This is a conclusion I'm asserting here. Instead, to support France and Britain. Instead, play the anti-colonial card and engage directly the US in the Middle East. Disastrous, disastrous. So just clearing up a few small details before I get to the gigantic reference to Gaza here. I said I would look into what the figure in today's US dollars the British government under Disraeli paid for the shares in the Suez Canal. Looks like it's 700 million US dollars. War is deceit. Hadith Bukhari 52-269. Diefenbaker was elected Prime Minister June 1957, tantalizingly close on the heels of Eden leaving. If Eden had stayed on literally for months, the Canadian government probably would have supported a lot of what Britain was doing. Not all. I mean, Diefenbaker had his own views on things, but so I was going to look into if Britain voted in favor or against or abstained in the UN vote on the establishment of the State of Israel in 1947, 1948. And I looked into it, and Britain abstained. The US voted yes, and seemed to lead most of the countries to vote yes on the establishment of the State of Israel. Obviously the vote held in New York. Britain voted to abstain. This is something people should remember today. The wonderful movie starring Charlton Heston and Laurence Olivier that just shows the British Empire in Egypt at its height is the movie Khartoum, in reference to the Sudan, and actually the stories of a Muslim messianic-like figure who, this is historically accurate, well, the man existed, who is going to go on a war, and he's going to pray in the mosque in Cairo. He's going to pray in the mosque in Istanbul. Very interesting story in that movie, Khartoum. That means he's going to go on international jihad. That's a historical that happened, and the British Empire was involved in that. Yeah, so the vote on the vote to establish Israel was 72% for, 28% against, 10 countries, including Britain, abstained. The signers to the Convention of Constantinople, I mistakenly just said a few of them, included in reality Britain, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Spain, France, Holland, Russia, and Turkey. Of course, the canal was actually on the territory of the Ottoman Empire, or Turkey. Egypt is not listed here. It was Turkish, or the Ottoman Empire, at the time the canal was built, and the Convention of Constantinople was signed 1888. There's a quote by Churchill that Canada was the linchpin of the English-speaking world. And you have to say, in this Suez Crisis, conspicuously, well, Canada sided with the UN, but if only Eden had, had a death grip on the helm for a few months, things, Diefenbaker would have been elected, or he was elected. So Canada, the linchpin. So there is some quote here. Sorry here. Yes, Winston Churchill had a deep affection for Canada. Wow, that's subjective, but he referred to Canada as, quote, the linchpin of the English-speaking peoples. And in this instance, the linchpin was under the control of the capital L Liberal Party. At this pivotal point, the linchpin was not in the hitch, let's say. It's obviously the Liberals under Saint Laurent and Pearson were obviously, veritable nationalists compared to, the Prince sunny ways that we have in today. And those Liberals are rolling over in their graves. There's nothing liberal about what's going on. Once again, shout out to my review of liberalism in the 19th century, George Brown. So I looked into who owns the Suez Canal today. The website of the Suez Canal Authority states that it's a state-owned Egyptian organization, company, you'd have to say. All the directors are Egyptian or Middle Eastern, no Europeans. Although they had a sort of a portrait gallery of the presidents of the Suez Canal, known as the Universal Company of the Suez Canal originally, and all these Frenchmen all the way down the line. And then 1956, it's all Egyptians. But they did actually have the portraits of the French presidents still up there. I don't know what Nasser would have thought of that. But the Canal Authority today, in 2023 or 2022, had revenue of $6.3 billion US a year. Decent company, decent sized company. It's obviously pretty big. Massive trade, exponential, or multiples more than 1956. So the geopolitical power of the Suez Canal has not decreased, it's only increased and increased. And it's completely under the control of Egypt. Now, the information that begs about Gaza Kyle does reference Gaza several times, although it's not the center of events. It is nonetheless an important theater, and there's developments here that are interesting to look at in the context of the current crisis. Forgive me, I need some background music here. So, yes, this is important information here, but I started off somewhere else. Yes, Gaza, page 33. Kyle characterizes the Gaza Strip as, quote, the most vivid single symbol of the unsolved Palestinian question. That's in 1991 he's writing that. Ben-Gurion successfully passed through the Israeli cabinet a majority vote to resettle the people in the Gaza Strip within Israel. Okay? but Egypt's forces had control of it and would not withdraw. This is in the Israeli Arab War of 1948-49. The West Bank annexed to Jordan April 1950. What did Egypt do with Gaza in the 1950s? Let's see. So, from page 35 of Kyle, Gaza differed in never being annexed by Egypt, which even half-heartedly allowed a phantom, quote, all-Palestine government to operate for a few months from the Strip. So Egypt is in control of the Gaza Strip. Egypt's calling the shots within the Gaza Strip. The refugees did not have Egyptian citizenship and were not allowed to get jobs in Egypt. The Strip was administered by the Egyptians who kept a military force there. But since Egypt was a poor country with her own severe social problems, she did not feel able to extend much help. This is a Kyle stating an opinion that is definitely open to critique. Is that the motivation of the Egyptians not allowing the Palestinians from Gaza to settle in Egypt? Once again, this is the one, and this is Kyle, this is not the Egyptians. The one large exception to this was in the field of higher education, where especially as the number of Egyptian universities increased in the 1950s, Palestinians were generously treated. For this reason, the Palestine Students' Union became the principal voice of the Palestinians in Cairo. I'm going to repeat that. For this reason, the Palestine Students' Union became the principal voice of the Palestinians in Cairo. From 1952, when he headed an all-party list of candidates on a platform of self-reliance until 1956, the PSU's president was Yasser Arafat, who, like King Hussein, began in these years his career of Arab leadership. So Kyle attributes the refusal of Egypt to settle the people in Gaza after the Israeli Arab War of 1948-49 in Egypt to the severe social problems she did not feel able to extend much help. This is once again this naivety of ascribing is it condescending of people in Arab countries and in other countries around non-Western countries that they're stupid or something? Egypt did not allow and is not allowing the Palestinians to settle in Egypt now because it would mean that they acknowledge the existence of the state of Israel. And Kyle is either self-deluded or he thinks that the Egyptians are stupid. He doesn't suspect them of being able to act in a Machiavellian way. Those people are kept in Gaza to serve as something that can be like when Palestinians suffer, it is a card that the Arab world can play to the suckers in the Western liberal media. By that, control Western and world opinion. But what the Economist, I guess, thinks that the Arabs are stupid. The Arabs understand the Economist better than the Economist understands the Arabs, apparently. Kyle here is naive. Egypt's leaders refused by this decision to acknowledge the permanent existence of the state of Israel. So all these what is going on now is just another instance, another chapter in the Gaza Strip functioning as the Egyptian leaders and other Arab leaders want it to function. The leaders of Egypt and the other Arab countries care more about their pride, refusing to give the Jews a state even after the Holocaust. They care more about their pride than the miserable plight of their fellow Muslims in Gaza. Now, let's hear some more though about the Gaza Strip at the point of the Suez Crisis. Find my own bloody references. I'm so sorry. Yes. So the conclusion that Egypt's behavior towards the Gaza Strip during the 1950s did not, as Kyle naively explains, have to do with social and economic difficulties in Egypt, but rather the refusal to accept the existence of the State of Israel, is confirmed by primary source information, by Nasser's response to Alpha, Eden and Dulles' plan to produce a permanent solution to Palestine. Nasser's rejection of two-state solution recorded by British Minister of State Anthony Nutting from a conversation with Nasser he had 25 October 1954, known as Record of Nile Barrage Conversation with Nasser, unquote. In the conversation, Nasser is recorded as saying that the problem was Israel, the problem of Palestine. Nasser is recorded as saying that the problem was Israel splitting the geographic contiguousness of the Arab world. It was not that Egypt needed or wanted Gaza and land connecting to Jordan and Iraq. It was not that Egypt needed or wanted Gaza and land connecting to Jordan and Iraq for itself. Nasser stated here he'd be glad Jordan had that land, including Gaza. Only Israel could not have it. So if you look at the map, the problem with Israel for Nasser, he is stating, is that, oh gosh, we don't even have a map of the whole area here. Well, you've got it a little bit. You've got Gaza. You've got Gaza there. You've got all this here down to there, down to the Red Sea there. And it's just this little bit of land there that Nasser just can't swallow, because he wants to have continual Arab land from Morocco to India. Morocco to India. And that one little sliver is Israel is just sticking in his craw. And that's what all the fuss is about. Which is ridiculous. Now, that's primary source evidence. Nasser says that. Let's see the note. Oh gosh. It's on page 57 of Kyle. I'm going to take the time here to actually look at the primary source footnote so I can quote it, because that is absolutely pivotal information. So, yes, quote, record of the Nile barrage conversation with Nasser. Nutting. Gosh. Kyle's research is so excellent, and these primary source references are references to British records. Foreign Office 371-111076. That's Foreign Office 371-111076. Nutting. Quote, record of Nile barrage conversation with Nasser, unquote. And the reference in those documents is 25.10.54. That's incredibly important primary source information. Is it the same today? Is it the geographic contiguousness of the Arab world that the Arabs really bothers them? That Israel's sticking down there? Is that the problem? They just don't want they want all Arabs around there? Somebody better find that out. Gaza is still, shockingly, 7 years after this conversation between Nutting and Nasser, in limbo. Nasser's not just saying it's just that the small little bit there at the bottom of the, like, he's not content with having a little, like, oh, he's gonna have a little bridge land there. No, he wants this whole bridge here. He wants Gaza east to Jordan. So there's a contiguous land bridge of the Arab world. Gaza is still, shockingly, 7 years after this conversation between Nutting and Nasser, in limbo. Why? Because of this pan-Arab dream. Unbroken empire from India to Morocco. It's all about that little wedge of land in southern Israel down to the Red Sea. Nasser is recorded as saying it's that wedge. Basically, that wedge sticks in his craw, splitting minutely the grand contiguousness of the Arab world. Nothing new. April 1956. Quote. See if we got some more info on Gaza here. Yes, this is information on Gaza in 1956. Until April 1956, the Fedayeen, who are irregular Palestinian fighters, had been used only on a small scale, but their existence meant that Nasser also now had available an instrument of reprisal. So Nasser's calling the shots in the Gaza Strip. Egypt is. And today, I mean, isn't that still the case? People, you don't hear it on the media, but the media are clueless. On 5 April, Egyptian gunfire across the line, often caused, according to UN observation, by deliberately provocative Israeli patrolling right up to the edge of the border, invited a disproportionate response. When heavy Israeli mortar fire was directed on the crowded shopping center of Gaza town, nowhere near the Egyptian gun position from which firing had been reported, 56 civilians were killed and 103 wounded. Oh my goodness, this is April 1956. By way of reply, Nasser sent the Fedayeen across the demarcation line in large numbers, causing extensive incidents of grenade throwing and demolition, killing a dozen Israelis, including school children at prayer. Oh my goodness, this is just so unbelievable. Oh. One, so Egypt calling the shots. See also page 414. The National Guards, Egyptian National Guards, and the Palestinian division that were manning the Gaza Strip were left to their fate. Now, this is at the outset of the Suez Crisis war. What happened at the Gaza Strip during the Suez Crisis? The National Guards and the Palestinian division that were manning the Gaza Strip were left to their fate. The governor of Gaza, so there was an Egyptian governor of Gaza, surrendered in the afternoon of 2 November, and with him the Israelis captured an archive of documents on the Fedayeen campaign. The Palestinian brigade managed to hold out at Khan Yunis until 3 November. Okay, so the Israelis occupied Gaza during the Suez Crisis. Oh, 351. There's too much going on here. Yes. During the planning of the Suez invasion by Israel, Britain, and France, Gaza was to be cut off from Egypt and left to sort out later. That's on Kyle 270. During the initial stage of the actual invasion on 29 October 1956, Gaza was quiet. Then Egypt's main forces pulled back to Sinai and Gaza was left to its fate. During the 1950s, the impression generally is that Egypt, the primary master controlling Gaza. What was Israel's policy towards Gaza at the end of the Suez Crisis? Page 536. Eben, that's the Israeli ambassador to the UN in New York, in a skillful propaganda campaign in the United States, concentrated on the Straits of Tiran, where Israel had a good case. So there was sort of two things kind of left hanging at the end of, the UN, Pearson's plan of the UN taking over started to be implemented, including in Gaza. But the Israelis were occupying Gaza, and as well as parts down, they swept over the entire Sinai Peninsula. Let's remember that. Didn't want to skip ahead of that, but the Israeli invasion occurred all across Sinai. You can see they got all the way down here. This is the Straits of Tiran. So they were holding this at the end of fighting, and as well as occupying the Gaza Strip. So these were sort of two cards they had. But Eben in New York is caring more about the Straits of Tiran than Gaza, I think. So Eben, in a skillful propaganda campaign in the US, concentrated on the Straits of Tiran, where Israel had a good case. They did not seek to annex Gaza or maintain a military force there, but Egypt should never go back, and the United Nations was not needed to go in. Okay. The Strip should continue to be administered and policed by the Israelis, who would supply services and develop local government. So more like the West Bank. Israel, the Strip, although the West Bank was not in the possession of Israel yet, like the West Bank today. The Strip should continue to be administered and policed by the Israelis, who should supply services and develop local government. Israel will make its full, quote, this is Eben, Israel will make its full contribution towards any UN plan for the permanent settlement of the refugees, including those in Gaza. So Israel is for the resettlement of the Palestinians in Gaza in other places. They didn't want them to stay there. This is what is happening at the end of the Suez Crisis. The commitment that the Israelis carefully avoided making was that this full contribution would take the form of the settlement of all the Gaza refugees inside Israel, though they would have taken some. The commitment that the Israelis carefully avoided making was that this full contribution would take the form of settlement of all the Gaza refugees inside Israel, though they would have taken some. So they were okay with taking some of the citizens of Gaza to settle in Israel, but not all. The fact was that Israel wanted Gaza out of Egypt's hands for security reasons, but was no more willing than before to absorb into Israel the enormous number of Palestinians that it contained. On 11 February 1957, this is at the end of the Suez Crisis, Dulles read Ibn an aide-memoire which commanded a withdrawal from Gaza that should be prompt and unconditional, but said that when Israel had obeyed, the UN should move in and, quote, be on the boundary between her and the Strip, a phrase which presumably meant, though it did not say so, on both sides of the boundary. Also, if Israel left Sharm el-Sheikh without conditions, thereby in effect vacating her offense, the UN would come in and the United States would be pledged to exercise the right of free passage into the Gulf of Aqaba, so that's down on the bottom of Sinai, for herself and would encourage others to do the same. We have a strong sense of moral responsibility, said the Presbyterian secretary. Why does he care that Dulles is Presbyterian? I don't really know. To take further steps if Israel withdraws and the blockade is resumed. We have a strong sense of moral responsibility, Dulles says, to take further steps if Israel withdraws and the blockade is resumed. Anyways, Israel and the United States, with their high moral standards, should work together and proceed hand in hand down the path towards peace and progress. So what does the Prime Minister of Israel, Ben-Gurion, think about what should be done in Gaza? So this did not make a brilliant impression upon Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion, still showing the effects of his recent bout of pneumonia, labored through a whole day of cabinet on the subject of Gaza. On 14 February, he emerged at the halfway point after a morning in which he had been the sole speaker, subjecting the American document to extended exegesis to give an interim report at the American ambassador. He seemed to Lawson, quote, completely spent by the effort, his voice nearly gone. The armistice agreements did not any longer exist, he croaked, and nothing would make Israel return to them. There must be an Israeli civil administration in Gaza, the nature of which he would like 2, 3, or 4 weeks to explore with the United States. So Ben-Gurion was for a Israeli civil administration in Gaza. So the U.S. policy here favored a larger role for the UN on the border between Gaza and Egypt and in Gaza. The Israeli policy was for an Israeli civil administration while settling most of the people in Gaza in other Arab countries and some in Israel. The Egyptian plan was to just leave the Gazans there on purpose with an Egyptian, or we get in here, administration. So these are the 3 sort of possible fates of Gaza, and it ended up being the third, which was followed. But the UN is there, I believe, temporarily, but let's see. The UN being involved in Gaza, reiterated by Dulles to the Israeli UN ambassador early 1957. The French also favored this at this point. The handover by Israel of Gaza to the UN and its subsequent administration by the UN. 539. So the Israelis handed the Gaza Strip over to the UN, who administered it temporarily. Anybody ask the people of Gaza? Anybody ask the Palestinian people? Not so far. But they do ask them. What did they say? So there's a Canadian general who's a UN general who's has the uncertain fate of being given responsibility for Gaza. So this is General Burns. The status of Gaza remained uncomfortably ambiguous. General Burns cabled Hammarskjöld, UN Secretary General, anxiously for instructions as to what to do if Egypt tried to send back elements of her civil administration and her military presence as soon as the Israelis had gone. Hammarskjöld replied that the initial takeover was to be done exclusively by the UN. Burns was not to commit himself to anybody about the future and not to give an impression of tacit acceptance of Israeli assumptions. General Burns got a tall order here. United Nations would run, quote, a full administration for, quote, a couple of weeks necessary in order to negotiate more definite arrangements with the Egyptians, unquote. This was not quite what Ben-Gurion and Abba Eban had in mind. In a private note, Hammarskjöld recorded that in order to, quote, get over the hump, unquote, Israel, France, and the US had, quote, had to hide the underlying conflict of views so as to not provoke an open discussion of the General Assembly. Oh my goodness. On Mrs. Meyer, that's Golda Meir's statement of 8 March, that everyone who had not criticized, this is getting into the weeds here, but on 6 March, the Israelis began evacuation of both places and were out in 48 hours. United Nations in both cases replaced them. The Egyptians promptly opened up the Suez Canal to vessels of 500 tons. So this is showing that the Egyptians care about what happens in Gaza. They are actually holding up the Suez Canal until the Israelis are gone, at least. They don't want the Israelis there, and they were blocking the canal until the Israelis were out of Gaza. So Gaza is pretty pivotal. Like, it's pretty important to the Egyptians. It's holding up the whole Suez Canal. As soon as the Israelis leave, the Egyptians open up the canal. But why do they care about it? The Egyptians promptly opened up the canal to vessels of 500 tons and gave permission to General Wheeler's men to start raising the 2 block ships. The links between the 2 events were never explicit but were quite apparent. That's Kyle giving us some excellent information. The Egyptians did care what was going on in Gaza, and they actually were blocking the canal until their wishes were on their way to being met. Back in February, Hammarskjöld had been thinking in terms of establishing in Gaza a full-dress international administration. He told Dixon that it would be an immense operation, far bigger than what the League of Nations had tried to do in Danzig. He had been thinking of appointing an Indian general as governor and bringing in the American General Lucius Clay as advisor. Okay. The Palestinians in favor of that? But this was to reckon without the Palestinian people, who, rather to the surprise of some of the UN staff, once again, this is the Western, globalist assumptions, clueless about the Arab culture or Arab cultures. Rather to the surprise of some of the UN staff, now demonstrated, this is the Palestinian people, in favor of renewed Egyptian rule. It was perfectly clear from the attitude of the crowds, General Burns wrote, that whatever they wanted, they did not want rule by outsiders. On 10 March, UN troops had to disperse a mob by firing over their heads, and 1 man was killed by a ricochet. It's not good press for the UN. Or their reputation amongst the Palestinians. The following day, the appointment was announced in Cairo of General Mohammed Abdul Latif as administrative governor of Gaza, and 3 days later he arrived to take up his duties. So Egypt's calling the shots in Gaza. The Israelis were appalled. Bourget Manoury, that's the French defense minister, informed the American Chargé that in concert with the British he was making preparations to provide air cover for the Israelis in case they found it necessary to reoccupy Gaza. Oh my goodness, this is serious stuff. What did it matter the Egyptian governor in Gaza what did it matter having an Egyptian governor in Gaza if the Egyptian army was not there and the UN provided a safeguard against the Fedayeen? As Fawzi said to Burns, Fawzi is the Egyptian foreign minister, as Fawzi said to Burns on 19 March 1957, the United Nations was now all over Gaza, but it would create trouble to announce it. Oh my goodness. The question of cooperation with the UN should be left to Egypt without anyone pressing too much. This formula was found to work. Found to work? Question mark, question mark, question mark. According to Kyle? According to The Economist? The presence of General Abdul Latif seemed to satisfy the feelings of the residents, at least to the extent of avoiding riots. Yeah, that's not really solving things. When Hammarskjöld arrived in Cairo on 21 March, it was possible for him to reach a 12-point oral agreement on Gaza with President Nasser, which lasted. Once again, lasted? Deliberately avoiding issues of principle, this was based on a list of practical requirements which Burns had drawn up for the UN in order to put a stop to infiltration and maintain order. For a few weeks, there was still some incidents of infiltration, but since the Egyptians had orders to cooperate with the United Nations in stamping them out, they rapidly dwindled. So Kyle is portraying that all is fine in Gaza now. The UN has stopped the Fedayeen from infiltrating Israel. Oh my goodness. Gaza became an advertisement for successful peacekeeping. Oh, that's just beyond words. That's written in 1991. Oh my goodness. This reinforces this horrid quote by Kyle. Reinforces a major conclusion about Kyle's liberal New World Order philosophy. It's naive, misjudges human nature, and results in continual chaos. So, I have presented all 600 pages of Keith Kyle's Suez, Britain's End of Empire in the Middle East. Good night.